Introduction. Hello everyone, I'm the narrator, and I'm here to help you today. I know you're using this video to sleep, so before we start, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let me know where you're from and what time it is as you're watching. Relax and unwind.
The bass pulsed through my body, but it couldn't drown out the panic rising in my chest. I was alone in a sea of strangers, the faces around me blurring into a kaleidoscope of neon paint and glitter. How could I have lost them so quickly? It was my first time at Dreamscape, one of those massive 3-day music festivals that take over entire fields. My friends had been planning this trip for months, and I'd finally caved to their pressure. "Come on, Mia," they'd said. "It'll be the experience of a lifetime." Some experience this was turning out to be. I'd only turned away for a second to buy a bottle of water. The crowd had surged forward, swept up in the pulsing rhythm of the headline act, and suddenly my friends were gone. I tried calling their names, but my voice was swallowed by the roar of the music and the cheering crowd. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the festival grounds, a knot of dread formed in my stomach. The once exciting sea of people now felt oppressive, closing in around me. I pushed my way through the crowd, muttering, "Excuse me" and "sorry," as I bumped into sweaty bodies and stepped on toes. I made my way to the edge of the main stage area, hoping for a better vantage point. The festival grounds stretched out before me, a labyrinth of tents, food stalls, and smaller stages. Colorful flags fluttered in the evening breeze, and the air was thick with the smell of fried food and cannabis. "You look lost," a voice said beside me. I turned to see a man in his early 30s, with kind eyes and a reassuring smile. He was wearing a festival staff t-shirt, which immediately put me at ease. "I admitted, relief washing over me. "I can't find my friends. We got separated in the crowd." He nodded sympathetically. "That happens a lot here. I'm Jake, by the way. I work security." "Mia," I replied, shaking his outstretched hand. "Do you think you could help me find them?" "Of course," Jake said, his smile widening. "That's what I'm here for. Why don't we head over to the Lost and Found tent? Sometimes people leave messages there for friends they've lost track of." I followed Jake through the crowd, grateful for his guidance. He moved with confidence, easily navigating the throngs of people. As we walked, he asked me about my friends, their names, what they were wearing, where I'd last seen them. I answered as best I could, my voice nearly drowned out by the music blaring from nearby speakers. We passed food stalls selling overpriced pizza and gyros, art installations that glowed and pulsed with otherworldly light, and circles of people swaying to their own internal rhythms. Under different circumstances, I might have found it all magical. Now it just felt overwhelming. "It's just up ahead," Jake said, pointing to a large tent with a Lost and Found banner. But as we approached, I realized something was off. The tent was dark, and there was no one around. "Are you sure this is it?" I asked, hesitating. Jake's hand closed around my wrist, his grip suddenly tight. "Trust me," he said, his voice losing its friendly tone. "I know exactly where we're going." Alarm bells started ringing in my head. I tried to pull away, but his grip was like iron. "Let go of me," I demanded, my voice shaking. He ignored me, dragging me towards the tent. I dug my heels into the ground, but the soft earth gave way beneath me. I opened my mouth to scream, but before I could, his other hand clamped over my mouth. "Shh," he hissed in my ear. "You don't want to make a scene, do you?" My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I could see people nearby, laughing and dancing, completely oblivious to what was happening just a few feet away. How could no one notice? Jake pulled me into the dark tent, and the sounds of the festival became muffled. My eyes struggled to adjust to the darkness. I could make out shapes, boxes stacked against the walls, a table, chairs. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Jake's laugh was cold and humorless. "Oh, Mia, you really shouldn't be so trusting. Pretty girl like you, all alone at a big festival like this? You're lucky I found you first." The implications of his words sent a chill down my spine. I knew I had to get out of there, and fast. I stomped hard on his foot, putting all my weight into it. He yelped in pain, his grip loosening just enough for me to wrench my arm free. I spun around, my hand connecting with his face in a wild, desperate slap. Jake staggered back, more surprised than hurt. I didn't wait to see his reaction. I bolted for the tent entrance, my heart in my throat. But as I burst out of the tent, I ran straight into someone else. Strong hands gripped my shoulders, steadying me. For a moment, I feared it was an accomplice of Jake's. But then I looked up and saw the official security uniform, the walkie-talkie, the stern but concerned expression. "Whoa there," the security guard said. "Are you all right?" Words tumbled out of me in a rush. "Please, you have to help me. There's a man in there. He said he was security, but he's not. He tried to." I was cut off by Jake emerging from the tent. His face was composed, but I could see the anger simmering in his eyes. "There you are," he said smoothly. "I was worried when you ran off like that." The security guard looked between us, confusion evident on his face. "What's going on here?" Jake stepped forward, his body language relaxed and open. "I'm so sorry about this. My girlfriend here had a bit too much to drink. I was just trying to get her some water and a place to sit down." I stared at him in disbelief. "He's lying. I don't even know him." The guard's hand went to his radio. "Sir, can I see some ID, please?" Jake's demeanor changed in an instant. He shoved the guard hard, sending him stumbling backwards, then took off running into the crowd. "Stop him!" I yelled, but he had already disappeared into the sea of people. The next few hours passed in a blur. More security arrived, then the police. I gave my statement over and over, describing Jake and what had happened. They searched the festival grounds, but there was no sign of him. As the adrenaline wore off, exhaustion set in. I sat wrapped in a scratchy emergency blanket, sipping lukewarm coffee from a paper cup. The festival continued around me, the music and laughter feeling surreal after what I'd just been through. "Mia, hey," I heard a familiar voice call. I looked up to see my friends pushing through the crowd, their faces etched with worry. "Oh my God, we've been looking everywhere for you." As they engulfed me in a group hug, the emotions I'd been holding back finally broke through. I sobbed into their shoulders, relief and fear and leftover adrenaline all pouring out at once. Later, as we sat in our tent, I recounted what had happened. My friends listened in horror, hugging me and assuring me that it wasn't my fault. "I can't believe we let you out of our sight," Sarah said, her voice thick with guilt. I shook my head. "It's not your fault. I'm just glad you found me." We didn't sleep much that night. Every noise outside the tent made me jump, and I kept imagining I saw Jake's face in the shadows. But surrounded by my friends, I felt safe for the first time in hours. As the sun rose on the final day of the festival, painting the sky in soft pinks and oranges, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let what happened define my experience. Jake had tried to take something from me, my trust, my sense of safety, but I refused to let him succeed. We emerged from our tent, blinking in the bright morning light. The festival was waking up around us, early risers doing yoga on the dewy grass, the smell of coffee and bacon wafting from food stalls. My friends looked at me uncertainly. "Are you sure you want to stay?" Tom asked. "We can go home if you want." I took a deep breath, looking out over the festival grounds. In the light of day, it looked different. Not the dark, threatening place it had become in my mind, but a place of music and joy and connection. "I'm sure," I said, surprising myself with the strength in my voice. "But promise me one thing." "Anything," they chorused. I managed a small smile. "Don't let me out of your sight again." As we walked towards the main stage, the first notes of music filling the air, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. What happened with Jake would always be a part of me, a lesson learned in the hardest way possible. But it didn't have to be the whole story. I was more than what had almost happened to me. I was a survivor, a friend, a music lover. And right now, I was exactly where I wanted to be, surrounded by people I trusted, ready to face whatever came next. The festival continued, and so did I. The silence hit me first. In all my years as a social worker, I'd never encountered a house so utterly, unnaturally quiet. The old farmhouse loomed before me, its weathered boards and peeling paint a stark contrast to the lush green fields surrounding it. Something was wrong. I could feel it in my bones. I'd been dreading this visit all morning. The Bradshaw family had a history of domestic disturbances, and my colleague who usually handled their case was out sick. "It's just a routine check-in," my supervisor had assured me. But as I stood on the creaking porch, my knuckles hovering inches from the door, I knew this was anything but routine. I knocked, the sound echoing ominously in the stillness. No response. I tried again, louder this time. Still nothing. The flutter of unease in my stomach grew into a churning knot of anxiety. "Hello?" I called out, pressing my ear to the door. "Mr. Bradshaw? Mrs. Bradshaw? It's Sarah from Social Services. I'm here for our scheduled visit." Silence. I reached for the doorknob, half expecting it to be locked. To my surprise, it turned easily in my hand. The door swung open with a low groan, revealing a darkened interior. "Hello?" I called again, stepping cautiously over the threshold. "Is anyone home?" The living room was a disaster. Furniture was overturned, picture frames lay shattered on the floor, and there were dark stains on the carpet that made my breath catch in my throat. My eyes darted around the room, taking in the scene of chaos. A lamp lay broken near the couch, its cord stretched taut across the floor. A vase of wilted flowers had spilled across the coffee table, water dripping steadily onto an open book below. My hand shook as I reached for my phone, ready to call the police, but a soft sound from upstairs made me pause. It was so faint I almost missed it, a whimper barely audible over the pounding of my own heart. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to get out and call for backup. But if someone was hurt up there, waiting for help. I swallowed hard and made my way towards the stairs, each step creaking under my weight. "Hello?" I called again, my voice trembling. "Is someone there? I'm here to help." Another whimper, louder this time. It was coming from behind a closed door at the end of the upstairs hallway. I approached slowly, my hand outstretched towards the doorknob. "I'm going to open the door," I said, trying to keep my voice calm and steady. "I'm not here to hurt you. I just want to make sure you're okay." I turned the knob and pushed the door open, revealing a small bedroom. At first glance, it appeared empty. But then I saw her, a little girl, no more than 7 or 8, huddled in the corner behind a dresser. Her eyes were wide with terror, her small body trembling. "Hey there," I said softly, crouching down to her level. "I'm Sarah. What's your name?" She didn't respond, just stared at me with those huge, frightened eyes. "It's okay," I continued, keeping my distance so as not to scare her further. "I'm here to help. Can you tell me what happened?" For a long moment, she remained silent. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "They took them." A chill ran down my spine. "Who took who, sweetheart?" "The bad men," she replied, her lower lip trembling. "They took Mommy and Daddy." My mind raced. Kidnapping? Home invasion? What had happened in this house? "When did this happen?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm despite the panic rising in my chest. "Last night," she said. "I hid in the closet like Daddy told me to. I heard yelling and then it got quiet." I nodded, my heart breaking for this little girl who had witnessed God knows what. "You did the right thing staying hidden," I assured her. "Can you come out now? I promise I'll keep you safe." She hesitated for a moment, then slowly crawled out from behind the dresser. I noticed she was clutching something tightly to her chest, a worn stuffed rabbit. "That's a nice bunny," I said, trying to put her at ease. "Does he have a name?" "Mr. Flopsy," she mumbled, hugging the toy tighter. "Well, Mr. Flopsy looks like a very good friend," I said with a gentle smile. "I bet he's been keeping you company, huh?" She nodded, the ghost of a smile flickering across her face. "What's your name, sweetie?" I asked. "Emily," she replied softly. "It's nice to meet you, Emily," I said. "I know you're scared, but I'm going to do everything I can to help you and find your parents, okay?" She nodded again, her eyes filling with tears. I knew I needed to get her out of the house and somewhere safe, but I also needed to preserve any evidence for the police. It was a delicate balance. "Emily, we need to leave now," I explained gently. "Is there anything you want to bring with you? Besides Mr. Flopsy, of course." She shook her head, clutching the stuffed animal even tighter. "Okay, that's fine. We'll come back for your things later," I assured her. "Can you be really brave for me and close your eyes while we go downstairs? I'm going to carry you." Emily nodded, squeezing her eyes shut and burying her face in Mr. Flopsy's fur. I scooped her up, my heart aching at how light she felt in my arms. As I carried her downstairs, I tried not to look too closely at the signs of struggle around us. I didn't want to risk Emily seeing anything that might traumatize her further. Once outside, I hurried to my car, settling Emily in the back seat. "You can open your eyes now, sweetie," I said as I buckled her in. "You're safe." As soon as she was secure, I stepped away from the car and called 911, my hands shaking as I relayed what I had found to the dispatcher. They assured me that police and child protective services were on their way. While we waited, I tried to keep Emily calm and distracted. "So, tell me about Mr. Flopsy," I prompted. "How long have you had him?" Emily hugged the rabbit close. "Since I was a baby," she said. "Mommy gave him to me." "He looks like he gives great hugs," I said with a smile. "I bet he's really good at keeping secrets too, huh?" Emily nodded solemnly. "He knows everything." I leaned in conspiratorially. "Do you think Mr. Flopsy might know anything about what happened last night?" Emily's eyes widened, and she looked down at the stuffed animal. For a moment I thought she might shut down again, but then she spoke in a whisper. "Mr. Flopsy says the bad men came because of Daddy's special books," she said. "The ones in the basement that I'm not supposed to know about." My mind raced. Special books in the basement? What had Mr. Bradshaw gotten himself into? Before I could ask any more questions, I heard sirens in the distance. Emily tensed at the sound. "It's okay," I reassured her quickly. "Those are the good guys coming to help us." As the police cars pulled up, followed closely by a CPS vehicle, I gave Emily's hand a gentle squeeze. "I need to talk to these people for a bit," I explained. "But I promise I'll be right back, okay?" She nodded, her grip on Mr. Flopsy tightening. The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. I gave my statement to the police, watched as they cordoned off the house and began their investigation, and worked with CPS to find a safe placement for Emily. Through it all, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had only scratched the surface of whatever was going on with the Bradshaw family. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the farmhouse, I found myself standing next to Detective Ramirez, the lead investigator on the case. "What do you think happened here?" I asked, keeping my voice low so Emily couldn't overhear from where she sat in the CPS car. Ramirez shook his head, his expression grim. "Hard to say for sure, but it doesn't look good. Signs of a struggle, blood spatter consistent with at least one gunshot wound. And then there's what we found in the basement." I raised an eyebrow. "The special books Emily mentioned?" "Yeah," Ramirez sighed. "Looks like Mr. Bradshaw was involved in some pretty serious money laundering. We found ledgers, offshore account numbers, the works. My guess, he got in over his head with some very dangerous people." I glanced back at Emily, my heart heavy. Her whole world had been shattered in a single night, and for what? Greed? Poor choices? "What happens now?" I asked. "We'll keep searching for the parents, but..." Ramirez trailed off, his implication clear. "As for the girl, she'll be placed in emergency foster care for now. We'll need to question her further, but given what she's been through, we'll have to tread carefully." I nodded, understanding the delicate balance between seeking justice and protecting a traumatized child. As I watched Emily being driven away, Mr. Flopsy clutched tightly to her chest. I couldn't help but think about all the other families out there, teetering on the edge of disaster. How many other Emilys were out there, one bad decision away from having their lives torn apart? I got into my own car, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. This job never got easier, never stopped breaking my heart. But as long as there were children like Emily who needed help, I knew I'd keep showing up, keep fighting for them. As I drove away from the farmhouse, leaving behind the flashing lights and yellow crime scene tape, I made a silent promise to Emily. I would see this through, no matter where it led. She deserved answers, justice, and a chance at healing. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but I was determined to walk it with her one step at a time. The headlights cut through the darkness like twin beams of hope, illuminating a lonely figure on the roadside. I'd always been taught never to pick up hitchhikers, but something about this guy, his defeated posture, the way he squinted against the glare of my high beams, made me slow down. Little did I know that simple act of kindness was about to turn into the most terrifying night of my life. I'd been driving for hours, the monotony of the highway broken only by the occasional flicker of my radio as it struggled to find a signal. The clock on my dashboard read 2:17 a.m., and the weight of fatigue pressed down on my eyelids. Maybe that's why I did it, why I pulled over when I saw him. Maybe I thought having someone to talk to would help keep me awake. As I eased onto the shoulder, gravel crunching under my tires, I got a better look at the man. He was tall and lanky, with a scruffy beard and clothes that had seen better days. A large backpack hung from one shoulder, and he held out his thumb with an air of desperation. I rolled down my passenger window, the cool night air rushing in. "Where you headed?" I called out. He jogged over, a relieved smile spreading across his face. "Just down the road a ways," he said, his voice gravelly. "Maybe the next town over if you're going that far." I hesitated for a moment, years of warnings from my parents echoing in my head. But the guy looked harmless enough, and it was such a desolate stretch of road. What kind of person would I be if I left him out here? "Hop in," I said, unlocking the doors. He tossed his backpack in the back seat and climbed in, filling the car with the musty scent of unwashed clothes and stale cigarette smoke. "Thanks, man," he said, buckling his seatbelt. "You're a lifesaver." I pulled back onto the highway, the silence between us stretching out uncomfortably. "I'm Jack," I offered, glancing over at him. "Mike," he replied, staring straight ahead. We drove in silence for a few miles, the only sound the hum of the engine and the rhythmic thump of tires on asphalt. I was starting to regret my decision when Mike finally spoke up. "So what brings you out this way so late?" he asked. "Just heading home from a business trip," I replied. "You?" Mike shrugged. "Just trying to get where I'm going." There was something evasive about his answer that set me on edge. I tried to shake it off, reminding myself that not everyone wants to spill their life story to a stranger. "Where's home for you?" I asked, trying to keep the conversation going. "Nowhere special," Mike said, then abruptly changing the subject. "Mind if I smoke?" I shook my head. "Sorry, no smoking in the car." Mike grunted in response, shifting in his seat. From the corner of my eye, I saw him reach into his pocket. My grip tightened on the steering wheel, a jolt of adrenaline shooting through me. But he just pulled out a pack of gum, popping a piece into his mouth. I relaxed a little, chuckling inwardly at my paranoia. We drove on, the miles ticking by in relative silence. I was just starting to think I'd misjudged the situation when I noticed Mike's behavior change. He began fidgeting more, constantly checking the side mirrors and glancing over his shoulder at the empty road behind us. His knee bounced up and down, and he kept running his hand through his greasy hair. "Everything okay?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. "Yeah, fine," he muttered, but his tone was anything but convincing. That's when I saw the flashing lights in my rearview mirror. A police cruiser was approaching fast, siren wailing. Without thinking, I started to pull over. "What are you doing?" Mike snapped, his voice suddenly sharp. "Pulling over for the cop," I said, confused by his reaction. "No!" he shouted, lunging across the center console and grabbing the wheel. "Keep driving." The car swerved violently, and I fought to regain control. "What the hell, man?" I yelled, shoving him back into his seat. But Mike was beyond reason. In one fluid motion, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a gun, pointing it directly at my head. I said, "Keep driving," he growled, his earlier affable demeanor completely gone. My blood ran cold, and I felt like I might throw up. With shaking hands, I pressed down on the accelerator, the speedometer climbing rapidly. "Mike, come on," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Whatever's going on, we can figure this out. Just put the gun down." He laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "Shut up and drive. Take the next exit." The police car was getting closer, its siren piercing through the night. I could see more flashing lights joining it in the distance. Whatever Mike had done, it was serious. As we approached the exit, I knew I had to make a decision. If I got off the highway, who knew where Mike would make me go or what he'd do to me? But if I stayed on this road, surrounded by cops, there was a good chance things would end violently. Time seemed to slow down as we neared the exit ramp. Mike was shouting something, but his words were drowned out by the blood rushing in my ears. In that moment, I made my choice. Instead of taking the exit, I slammed on the brakes and yanked the wheel hard to the right. The car spun, tires screeching against the pavement. Mike was thrown against the door, the gun flying from his hand. We came to a stop perpendicular to the highway, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. Before Mike could recover, I unbuckled my seatbelt and flung myself out of the car, stumbling onto the asphalt. "Help!" I screamed, waving my arms frantically at the approaching police cars. "He has a gun." Everything after that was a blur of flashing lights, shouted commands, and the cold metal of handcuffs as the police secured both Mike and me. It wasn't until I was sitting in the back of a police car, a shock blanket draped over my shoulders, that the reality of what had happened began to sink in. As it turned out, Mike was wanted for a string of armed robberies across 3 states. He'd been hitchhiking his way across the country, using unsuspecting drivers like me to evade the police. If I hadn't made that split-second decision to stop the car, who knows where I might have ended up. The police questioned me for hours, going over every detail of my encounter with Mike. By the time they were finished, the sun was peeking over the horizon, painting the sky in soft pinks and oranges. It was beautiful in a surreal sort of way. An officer drove me to retrieve my car, which had been towed to a nearby impound lot. As I slid into the driver's seat, I was hit by a wave of emotion. Relief, fear, anger, gratitude. My hands shook as I gripped the steering wheel, the memory of Mike's gun still fresh in my mind. I sat there for a long time, unable to bring myself to start the engine. The events of the night played on repeat in my head. How could I have been so stupid, so naive? I'd always prided myself on being a good judge of character, on trusting my instincts. But in one night, all that confidence had been shattered. Finally, I took a deep breath and turned the key. The engine rumbled to life, a comforting sound in the quiet morning. As I pulled out of the impound lot, I made a silent vow to myself. No more picking up hitchhikers, no matter how harmless they might seem. No more putting blind trust in strangers. The road stretched out before me, empty and inviting. But as I merged onto the highway, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed. The world suddenly seemed darker, more dangerous. Every car that passed felt like a potential threat, every rest stop a possible ambush. I drove straight through the day, stopping only for gas and coffee. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the sun was setting again. I'd been awake for over 36 hours, but sleep felt impossible. As I unlocked my front door, I was struck by how normal everything looked. My house, my neighborhood, it was all exactly as I'd left it. But I wasn't the same person who had left on that business trip just a few days ago. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't stop thinking about Mike. What had led him to that life? What series of choices had brought him to that lonely stretch of highway, waiting for someone like me to come along? And what about me? How many times had I put myself in danger without even realizing it? How many close calls had I had that I'd been blissfully unaware of? In the days and weeks that followed, I found myself jumping at shadows, second-guessing every interaction with strangers. The world had always been a dangerous place, I knew that. But now, that danger felt immediate, personal. Slowly, though, I began to heal. I talked to a therapist, installed a security system in my house, took a self-defense class. Little by little, I reclaimed my sense of safety, my trust in the world. But I never forgot that night on the highway. Every time I pass a hitchhiker now, I feel a pang of guilt as I drive by. But then I remember Mike's gun, the terror in those moments when I thought I might die, and I pressed down on the accelerator. Some lessons I've learned are worth the pain they cause, and some acts of kindness are better left undone. The first sign that something was off was the smell. A sharp chemical odor that didn't belong in my aunt's quaint country neighborhood. But by the time I realized what it meant, I was already in too deep. I'd agreed to house sit for my Aunt Linda while she visited her sister in Florida. It seemed like a dream gig. 2 weeks in a cozy farmhouse surrounded by rolling fields and not much else. A perfect escape from my cramped city apartment and high-stress job. I'd envisioned lazy days reading on the porch, maybe trying my hand at gardening. What I got instead was a front row seat to a nightmare. The house next door had always been empty as far as I knew. A rundown old farmhouse that Aunt Linda said had been abandoned for years. So when I saw lights on there my second night, I was curious but not alarmed. Maybe someone had finally bought the place. I was in the kitchen making dinner when I first noticed the smell. It was faint at first, barely noticeable over the aroma of the pasta sauce I was simmering. But as the evening wore on, it grew stronger, acrid, chemical. By the time I went to bed, my eyes were watering and my throat felt scratchy. I woke up in the middle of the night, coughing. The smell had permeated the whole house. Groggy and disoriented, I stumbled to the window and peered out. That's when I saw them. Shadowy figures moving around the neighboring house, carrying large containers and boxes. My heart started racing. This wasn't some new neighbor doing late-night renovations. This was something else entirely. I reached for my phone, ready to call the police, but hesitated. What if I was overreacting? What if it was just some harmless explanation I hadn't thought of? The last thing I wanted was to cause a scene in my aunt's quiet neighborhood. So instead, I watched and waited. The next day, I tried to go about my routine as normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. The smell was still there, fainter now, but persistent. And there was activity next door. Cars coming and going, always with tinted windows and out-of-state plates. I found myself spending more time on the porch, pretending to read while actually keeping an eye on the house next door. That's how I noticed the pattern. Every few hours, a different car would pull up. Someone would get out, go inside for exactly 15 minutes, then leave with a small package. It hit me all at once. The chemical smell, the late-night activity, the steady stream of visitors. They were cooking meth, right next door to my aunt's house. My first instinct was to pack up and leave, call Aunt Linda, tell her what was happening, and get the hell out of there. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the thought of drug dealers setting up shop in this peaceful neighborhood. Maybe it was concern for my aunt's safety when she returned. Or maybe it was just morbid curiosity. Whatever the reason, I decided to stay and gather more information. I started taking notes, times of arrivals and departures, descriptions of cars and people. I even tried to snap a few discreet photos with my phone, though they didn't come out very clear. 3 days into my amateur surveillance, things took a turn. I was out in the backyard, hanging laundry on the line, and, admittedly, trying to get a better view of the neighboring property, when I heard a shout. "Hey, you, I turned to see a man standing at the fence between the two properties. He was tall, muscular, with tattoos snaking up his arms and a look in his eyes that made my blood run cold. "Can I help you?" I called back, trying to keep my voice steady. He vaulted over the fence with surprising agility for his size. As he approached, I could smell cigarette smoke and something chemical clinging to his clothes. "You've been watching us," he said. It wasn't a question. I felt my heart hammering in my chest. "I don't know what you're talking about," I lied. "I'm just here taking care of my aunt's place." He smirked, clearly not buying it. "Yeah? And I suppose you always spend hours sitting on the porch staring at an empty house." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. He took another step closer, and I instinctively backed away. "Listen closely," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Whatever you think you know, whatever you think you've seen, forget it. We're not here. You didn't see anything. Understand?" I nodded mutely, too terrified to speak. "Good," he said. "Because if I find out you've been talking to anyone, cops, neighbors, anyone, well..." He let the threat hang in the air, unfinished but crystal clear. With that, he turned and walked away, hopping back over the fence with ease. I stood there, rooted to the spot, laundry forgotten in my hands for what felt like hours. That night I didn't sleep. I sat by the window, watching the house next door, jumping at every sound. The chemical smell seemed stronger than ever, burning my nostrils and making my head ache. I knew I should leave, call the police from a safe distance and let them handle it. But something kept me there. A sense of responsibility, perhaps. Or maybe just the stubborn belief that I could handle this on my own. The next day passed in a haze of anxiety and adrenaline. I went through the motions of my daily routine, all while keeping a wary eye on the house next door. The steady stream of cars continued, each visitor staying for exactly 15 minutes before leaving with their small package. As night fell, I made a decision. I couldn't just sit back and do nothing. I needed evidence, something concrete I could take to the police. And I knew just where to get it. Waiting until well after midnight, I crept out of the house. The night was eerily quiet, with only the chirping of crickets and the distant hoot of an owl. I made my way across the yard, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure someone would hear it. The old farmhouse loomed before me, dark and forbidding. I circled around to the back where I'd noticed a partially open window earlier. Taking a deep breath, I hoisted myself up and squeezed through. The smell hit me like a physical force. My eyes watered and my throat burned. I pulled my shirt up over my nose, trying to filter the air, but it didn't help much. I found myself in what must have once been a kitchen. Now it was filled with makeshift lab equipment. Beakers, hot plates, plastic containers filled with various chemicals. On a table in the corner, I saw stacks of cash and bags of a crystalline substance I knew had to be meth. With shaking hands, I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures. The lab setup, the drugs, the money, anything that could serve as evidence. I was so focused on documenting everything that I almost missed the sound of a car pulling up outside. Panic surged through me. I looked around frantically for a place to hide, but the kitchen was too exposed. I could hear voices now, getting closer. In desperation, I dove into a nearby closet, pulling the door shut just as the back door opened. Through a crack in the door, I watched as two men entered the kitchen. One was the tattooed man who had threatened me earlier. The other was someone I hadn't seen before. Older, well-dressed, looking entirely out of place in this dilapidated drug den. "As you can see," Tattoo Man was saying, "production is going smoothly. We should have the next batch ready by Friday." The older man nodded, looking around with an appraising eye. Good. And no problems with the locals?" Tattoo Man hesitated. "Well, there is one small issue. The woman next door. She's been watching the place. I warned her off, but..." The older man's expression hardened. "But nothing. We can't afford any loose ends. Take care of it." My blood ran cold. They were talking about killing me. Tattoo Man nodded. "Consider it done." They continued talking, discussing distribution plans and profit margins, but I barely heard them. My mind was racing, trying to figure out how I was going to get out of this alive. After what felt like an eternity, the two men left. I waited several minutes, listening intently for any sign that they might return, before finally emerging from the closet. My legs were shaking so badly I could barely walk, but somehow I made it back to the window. As I climbed out, I heard a shout behind me. I didn't look back, just ran as fast as I could across the yard and back into my aunt's house. I slammed the door behind me, locking it with trembling hands. Then I sank to the floor, my back against the door, and finally let the tears come. When I could breathe again, I pulled out my phone. My fingers hovered over the keypad for a moment before I dialed 911. "Emergency services. What's your emergency?" I took a deep breath. "I need to report a crime. A big one." The next few hours passed in a blur of police sirens, flashing lights, and endless questions. I watched from the window as the quiet country night erupted into chaos. Police cars swarmed the property next door, officers in tactical gear storming the house. As dawn broke, an officer came to take my statement again. He looked tired but satisfied. "You did good," he told me. "We've been trying to crack this operation for months. Your evidence was the break we needed." I nodded, too exhausted to feel much of anything. "We'll need you to come down to the station later to make a formal statement," he continued. "And you might want to find somewhere else to stay for a while, just to be safe." I knew he was right. Even with the main players in custody, there was no guarantee that everyone involved had been caught. I was a loose end, and loose ends had a way of getting tied up permanently in situations like this. As I packed my bags, I couldn't help but laugh at the irony. I'd come here looking for a peaceful escape from my hectic life. Instead, I'd walked right into the biggest adventure, and the biggest danger I'd ever faced. I took one last look around the quaint farmhouse, now forever changed in my eyes. The smell of chemicals still lingered in the air, a reminder of how quickly the illusion of safety can be shattered. As I drove away, leaving behind the flashing lights and crime scene tape, I realized something. Life doesn't always give you what you expect. Sometimes it throws you into the deep end, forcing you to sink or swim. And sometimes you surprise yourself with just how well you can swim when you have to. I may not have gotten the relaxing vacation I'd hoped for, but I'd gotten something else. A reminder of my own strength, and the knowledge that even in the darkest situations, there's always a choice to do the right thing. The open road stretched out before me, full of possibilities, and for the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe again. The sound of splintering wood jolted me awake. For a split second, I thought I was dreaming. Then I heard the voices, gruff, urgent, and definitely not belonging to my wife. That's when I knew our romantic getaway had just turned into a nightmare. Sarah and I had been planning this trip for months. A week in a secluded cabin, just the two of us, no cell phones, no internet, a chance to reconnect away from the chaos of our busy lives. We'd found the perfect spot online, a cozy little place nestled in the woods, miles from the nearest town. It looked like something out of a postcard. We arrived late Friday afternoon, the sun already dipping below the tree line. The cabin was everything we'd hoped for, rustic but comfortable, with a big stone fireplace and windows that looked out onto nothing but forest. As we unpacked, I remember thinking how peaceful it was. The only sounds were birdsong and the whisper of wind through the pines. We spent that first evening exploring the trails around the cabin, hand in hand like teenagers. When night fell, we curled up by the fire with a bottle of wine, talking and laughing like we hadn't in years. It felt like we were the only two people in the world, if only that had been true. The break-in happened on our second night. We'd gone to bed early, tired from a day of hiking. I'm not sure what time it was when the noise woke me. Sometime after midnight, I think. At first I thought maybe a branch had fallen on the roof. But then I heard the voices, and my blood ran cold. "Check the bedroom," someone whispered. "And be quiet about it." I nudged Sarah awake, pressing a finger to my lips. Her eyes widened in fear as she heard the footsteps approaching our room. I motioned for her to hide under the bed, then positioned myself behind the door, heart pounding so loud I was sure they'd hear it. The door creaked open slowly. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tense. A figure stepped into the room, tall, broad-shouldered, carrying what looked like a shotgun. Before I could think, I acted on pure adrenaline. I slammed the door into him as hard as I could. The man grunted in pain and surprise, stumbling forward. His gun clattered to the floor. I dove for it, my fingers closing around the cold metal just as he regained his balance. We grappled for control, rolling across the floor in a desperate struggle. "What's going on in there?" a voice shouted from the other room. "Bobby, you okay?" I managed to wrench the shotgun away, scrambling to my feet and pointing it at my attacker. He froze, hands raised. "Don't move," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Sarah, get out from under the bed, we're leaving." Sarah crawled out, her face pale with fear. I could hear the other intruders moving around in the main room of the cabin, their footsteps heavy and purposeful. "Listen," the man I'd knocked down said, his voice low and urgent. "You don't understand. We're not here to hurt you. We just need a place to lay low for a while." "Shut up," I snapped. "Sarah, grab our phones and the car keys. We're getting out of here." But as Sarah moved towards the nightstand, the bedroom door burst open again. Two more men rushed in, both armed. I swung the shotgun towards them, my finger tightening on the trigger. "Whoa, whoa," one of them shouted. "Easy there, buddy. Let's all just calm down." It was a tense standoff. Me with the shotgun, Sarah cowering behind me, and three dangerous-looking men blocking our only exit. I could feel sweat beading on my forehead, my arms starting to shake from the weight of the gun. "Look," the one who seemed to be the leader said, "we don't want any trouble. We're in a bit of a situation here, and we just need somewhere to hide out for a day or two. You let us stay, keep quiet about it, and everyone walks away happy. Deal?" I laughed, a short, harsh sound. "You break into our cabin in the middle of the night, armed, and you expect us to just be okay with that? Who the hell are you people?" The leader sighed, lowering his gun slightly. "You really want to know? Fine. We just robbed a bank in town. Things got messy. We need to lay low until the heat dies down. That's all you need to know." My mind reeled. Bank robbers. We were being held hostage by actual bank robbers. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. "Please," Sarah whispered from behind me. "Just let us go. We won't tell anyone, I swear." The leader shook his head. "Can't do that. Can't risk you running to the cops. But listen, we're not animals. You two just sit tight. Don't cause any trouble, and this'll all be over before you know it." I knew we didn't have a choice. Even with the shotgun, we were outnumbered and outgunned. Slowly, I lowered the weapon. "Smart move," the leader said. "Now how about we all go have a nice chat in the living room? Bobby, tie them up, gently." The next few hours were surreal. Sarah and I sat on the couch, hands bound behind our backs, watching as these criminals made themselves at home in our rented cabin. They rummaged through our supplies, helped themselves to our food and drinks, and argued among themselves about their next move. I learned their names as they talked. Besides Bobby, there was the leader, Frank, and the youngest one, Tommy. They seemed jumpy, on edge. I gathered that the robbery hadn't gone as smoothly as they'd planned. There was talk of someone getting shot, of a dye pack exploding in one of the money bags. As dawn broke, casting long shadows through the cabin windows, I began to formulate a plan. I'd noticed that Tommy, the youngest, seemed uncomfortable with the situation. He kept glancing at Sarah and me, guilt written all over his face. If I could get him alone, maybe I could convince him to help us. My chance came mid-morning. Frank and Bobby went outside to check the perimeter, leaving Tommy to watch us. As soon as they were gone, I spoke up. "Hey, Tommy," I said, keeping my voice low and calm. "You don't seem like a bad kid. How'd you get mixed up with these guys?" He startled, looking at me with wide eyes. It's complicated. I needed money and Frank said it would be easy." I didn't know. "It's not too late," I pressed. "Help us get out of here and we'll tell the cops you were forced into it. You could still have a future." I saw the conflict in his eyes, the way he chewed his lip nervously. For a moment I thought I'd gotten through to him. But then the door opened and Frank walked back in. Tommy clammed up immediately. The day dragged on endlessly. We were allowed bathroom breaks under close supervision, given water and some stale crackers to eat. The robbers argued constantly, their nerves fraying as they debated their next move. I caught snatches of their conversation, something about a rendezvous point, a boat waiting to take them out of the country. As night fell again, I began to lose hope. Would anyone even notice we were missing? We told our families we'd be out of touch for the week. By the time anyone realized something was wrong, it might be too late. But then, sometime after midnight, everything changed. We heard it at the same time, the distant wail of police sirens. The robbers froze, panic written across their faces. "How the hell did they find us?" Frank snarled, grabbing his gun. "Tommy, you little rat, did you make a call?" Tommy shook his head frantically. "No, I swear, I didn't do anything." As they argued, I caught Sarah's eye. She gave me the tiniest nod and I understood. While they'd been distracted earlier, she'd managed to activate the emergency SOS on her smartwatch. The cavalry was coming. What followed was chaos. Frank and Bobby grabbed their guns and money, preparing to make a run for it. Tommy stood paralyzed, unsure what to do. And through it all, the sirens grew louder. In the confusion, I managed to work my bonds loose. As soon as my hands were free, I lunged for the shotgun they'd left propped against the wall. "Nobody move," I shouted, swinging the gun towards the robbers. For a moment, nobody breathed. Then Frank raised his gun, aiming straight at me. I saw his finger tighten on the trigger and closed my eyes, certain these were my last moments. The gunshot was deafening in the small cabin. But the pain I expected didn't come. I opened my eyes to see Frank on the ground, clutching his shoulder. Tommy stood over him, a small pistol shaking in his hands. "I couldn't," Tommy said, his voice breaking. "I couldn't let you kill them." The next few minutes were a blur. Police swarmed the cabin, shouting orders. Sarah and I were ushered outside, wrapped in blankets and checked over by paramedics. As the adrenaline wore off, I found myself shaking uncontrollably. In the days that followed, we gave countless statements to the police. We learned that the robbery had indeed gone wrong. A security guard had been shot, though thankfully not fatally. Tommy's testimony, along with ours, ensured he got a lighter sentence than his companions. Sarah and I went home, but things didn't just go back to normal. We both jumped at loud noises, had trouble sleeping, but in a strange way, the experience brought us closer. We'd faced the unthinkable together and come out the other side. We never did go back to that cabin, but sometimes on quiet evenings at home, we'll look at each other and know we're both thinking about it, about how quickly life can change, how thin the line is between safety and danger, and we'll hold each other a little tighter, grateful for each moment of peace we have. Because if we learned anything from those terrifying days, it's that you never know when everything might change in the blink of an eye. The crunch of leaves under my boots was the only sound in the forest until I heard the voices. Low, urgent whispers that didn't belong in this peaceful wilderness. I froze, my heart pounding as I realized I was no longer alone, and what I was about to witness would turn my solitary camping trip into a fight for survival. I'd always been a bit of a loner, preferring the company of trees and wildlife to most people. So when I got a week off work, I didn't hesitate to pack my gear and head into the Cascade Mountains for some solo camping. I'd been looking forward to this trip for months, just me, my tent, and miles of unspoiled nature. The first 2 days were everything I'd hoped for. I hiked deep into the backcountry, setting up camp in a small clearing next to a babbling creek. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine and wildflowers. At night, I'd sit by my small campfire, marveling at the blanket of stars overhead, untouched by city lights. On the third day, I decided to explore further up the mountain. I packed a day bag with water, snacks, and my first aid kit, leaving my main camp set up. The trail was challenging but rewarding, offering breathtaking views of the valley below. It was late afternoon when I heard the voices. I'd stopped to rest on a fallen log, taking in the peaceful sounds of the forest, when the unnatural noise caught my attention. Curiosity got the better of me, and I moved quietly towards the source. As I crept closer, ducking behind trees and boulders, the voices became clearer. 2 men, maybe 3, talking in hushed but agitated tones. I couldn't make out the words, but the tension in their voices was unmistakable. Finally, I reached the edge of a small clearing. Peering around a large oak tree, I saw them. 3 men, dressed in dark clothing, standing around what looked like a shallow grave. My blood ran cold as I watched one of them drag a large tarp-wrapped bundle towards the hole. I knew instantly what I was seeing, but my mind refused to accept it. This couldn't be happening. Not here, not in my peaceful forest retreat. One of the men, tall, with a jagged scar across his cheek, seemed to be in charge. He barked orders at the others as they maneuvered the bundle into the grave. I couldn't tear my eyes away, even as every instinct screamed at me to run. Then, in a moment of carelessness born of shock, I shifted my weight. A twig snapped under my foot, the sound impossibly loud in the tense silence. 3 heads snapped in my direction. For a heartbeat, time seemed to stand still. Then the scarred man shouted, "Get him!" and chaos erupted. I ran like I'd never run before, crashing through undergrowth, leaping over fallen trees, my lungs burning and my heart threatening to burst from my chest. I could hear them behind me, their heavy footsteps and angry shouts spurring me on. I had no plan, no destination in mind. My only thought was to put as much distance between myself and those men as possible. But they knew these woods too, and they were gaining on me. A gunshot rang out, the bullet splintering bark inches from my head. I ducked instinctively, losing my footing on the uneven ground. I tumbled down a steep embankment, branches whipping my face and rocks bruising my body. I came to a stop at the bottom, dazed and winded. For a moment I lay there, certain that this was the end. But then I heard their voices again, closer now, and survival instinct kicked in. Ignoring the pain in my ribs and the warm trickle of blood down my face, I forced myself to my feet and started moving again. The forest was growing darker as evening approached, shadows lengthening and blurring the landscape. I used it to my advantage, zigzagging between trees, doubling back on my trail when I could. My pursuers' voices grew more distant, then closer again. They were spreading out, trying to flank me. As night fell completely, I found myself in unfamiliar territory. In my panic, I'd run far off any marked trail. I was lost, being hunted, with no supplies and no way to call for help. The gravity of my situation hit me like a physical blow. I needed to think, to come up with a plan. Blindly running wasn't going to save me. I forced myself to stop, pressing my back against a large tree and trying to quiet my ragged breathing. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I took stock of my surroundings. To my left, the ground sloped sharply downward. To my right, I could make out the silhouette of a large boulder formation. And ahead, was that the glimmer of water? The idea formed in my mind. It was risky, but it was the only plan I had. Taking a deep breath, I started moving again, this time with purpose. I made my way towards the water, moving as quietly as I could. Every snapping twig and rustling leaf sounded like a gunshot to my paranoid ears. But I pressed on, driven by desperation and the faint hope of survival. Finally, I reached the edge of what turned out to be a fast-moving river. In the moonlight, I could see white water churning over rocks. It was dangerous, potentially deadly. But it was also my best chance at escaping my pursuers. I was about to step into the water when a voice called out behind me, "Stop right there!" I turned to see the scarred man emerging from the trees, his gun trained on my chest. The other 2 were close behind, their faces twisted with anger and exertion. "Nowhere left to run," Scar said. a cruel smile playing on his lips. Should have minded your own business, boy. I raised my hand slowly, my mind racing. I was out of options, out of time. Look, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I don't know who you are or what you're involved in. I didn't see anything. Just let me go, and I swear I won't say a word to anyone. Scar laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. Nice try, kid. But we can't take that chance. Nothing personal, you understand, just business. As he raised his gun, time seemed to slow down. I saw his finger tightening on the trigger. I saw the grim satisfaction in his eyes, and I made a choice. I threw myself backwards into the river. The shock of the cold water drove the air from my lungs. For a moment, panic overwhelmed me as the current grabbed me, tumbling me head over heels. I fought to surface, gasping for air as I was swept downstream. Gunshots rang out, bullets splashing into the water around me. But the river was my ally now, carrying me swiftly away from danger. I caught glimpses of my pursuers running along the bank, shouting in frustration as I was carried out of range. The next few minutes, or was it hours, were a blur of churning water, sharp rocks, and desperate gasps for air. I was battered and bruised, swallowing mouthfuls of river water, certain that each moment would be my last. Finally, the current slowed. With the last of my strength, I managed to grab onto a low-hanging branch and pull myself to the shore. I lay there on the muddy bank, coughing and shaking, too exhausted to move. As the adrenaline faded, the reality of my situation set in. I was alive, but I was also lost, injured, and being hunted by killers. I had no food, no supplies, and no idea where I was. The night was cold, and in my wet clothes, hypothermia was a real risk. But I wasn't ready to give up. I'd survived this far, and I was determined to see it through. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, I forced myself to my feet. Every muscle screamed in protest, but I ignored the pain. I had to keep moving. I followed the river, figuring it was my best chance of finding civilization. As I walked, I tried to piece together what I'd witnessed. Who were those men? Who had they killed? And how was I going to get out of this alive? Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, its warmth slowly drying my clothes. I was exhausted, hungry, and scared, but I kept putting one foot in front of the other. Every snapping twig made me jump, certain that my pursuers had found me again. It was mid-afternoon when I heard the most beautiful sound in the world: car engines. I quickened my pace, hope surging through me. Soon I broke through the tree line and saw a road, and there, like a mirage, was a ranger station. I practically fell through the door, startling the two rangers inside. "Please," I gasped. "I need help. There are men in the forest. They killed someone." What followed was a whirlwind of activity. Park rangers, then state police, then even FBI agents questioned me for hours. Search parties were organized. Helicopters scoured the area where I'd seen the men. In the end, they found the grave, just as I'd described it. The body was identified as a local businessman who'd gone missing weeks earlier. But of the three men, there was no sign. The authorities praised me for my bravery, but I didn't feel brave. I felt lucky, and more than a little foolish. My solo adventure had nearly cost me my life. As I finally headed home days later, I knew I'd never look at the wilderness the same way again. The forest, once my sanctuary, now held shadows and secrets I'd never noticed before. But it had also shown me a strength I didn't know I possessed. I don't go camping alone anymore, but I do still venture into the woods from time to time. And when I do, I'm always alert, always watching. Because I learned the hard way that even in the most beautiful places, darkness can lurk just out of sight. And sometimes survival depends on being ready for anything. The night shift at Joe's Diner was usually quiet. A few truckers, maybe some insomniacs looking for a late-night coffee fix. But the moment those 5 men walked in, the air changed. It was like a storm rolling in, and I was stuck right in its path. I'd been working at Joe's for about 6 months, ever since I dropped out of college. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills and gave me time to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. Most nights I actually enjoyed the solitude, the rhythm of brewing coffee and flipping burgers in the wee hours of the morning. That night started like any other. It was about 2 a.m., and I was wiping down the counter for the 100th time, half listening to the old jukebox in the corner playing some twangy country song. The only customers were a middle-aged couple in a booth near the window. quietly picking at a shared slice of apple pie. The bell over the door jingled, and I looked up to see them walk in. 5 men, all dressed too nicely for our little roadside diner. They were laughing and talking loudly, an air of barely contained energy about them. Something in their eyes, in the way they moved, set me on edge immediately. "Evening, gentlemen," I said, plastering on my best waitress smile. "What can I get for you?" The one who seemed to be the leader, a tall man with salt and pepper hair, grinned at me. There was something predatory in that smile. "Coffee," he said. "Lots of it. And keep it coming, sweetheart." I bristled at the sweetheart, but kept my face neutral. No point in antagonizing customers, especially not a group like this. I poured their coffee and retreated behind the counter, keeping a wary eye on them. They took up residence in the largest booth, still talking and laughing. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but their tone made me nervous. Every now and then, one of them would glance around the diner, as if checking to see who was watching. The middle-aged couple finished their pie and asked for the check. As the woman stood up to leave, one of the men let out a low whistle. "Hey, baby," he called out. "Why don't you ditch Grandpa there and come sit with us? We'll show you a good time." The woman's husband stood up, his face reddening. "Now see here." But the leader of the group cut him off. "Sit down, old man. We're just having a little fun." I could see the situation escalating quickly. "Sir," I said, addressing the couple, "your check is ready at the counter. Have a good night." The couple hurried to pay and left, the bell jingling behind them. Now it was just me and the 5 men. The diner suddenly felt very small. For a while they seemed content to drink their coffee and talk amongst themselves. But as the night wore on, they got louder, more aggressive. They started making crude jokes, some of them directed at me. I tried to ignore it, to just do my job, but my hands were shaking as I refilled their cups. Around 3:30, the bell jingled again. A young woman walked in, probably in her early 20s. She looked tired, maybe coming off a late shift herself. I saw the men's heads turn, like wolves spotting prey. "Well, well," the leader said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Looks like the party's just getting started." The woman glanced nervously at the group, then at me. I tried to convey a warning with my eyes, but she just sat down at the counter and asked for a menu. One of the men, a muscular guy with tattoos covering his arms, got up and sauntered over to her. "Hey, beautiful, why don't you come sit with us? We'll buy you whatever you want." The woman shook her head. "No, thank you, I'm fine here." But Tattoos wasn't taking no for an answer. He put his hand on her shoulder. "Come on, don't be like that. We're nice guys, I promise." I saw the fear in her eyes, the way she tensed under his touch. Before I could think better of it, I spoke up. "Sir, please leave her alone. She said she's not interested." The diner went quiet. 5 pairs of eyes turned to me and I felt my stomach drop. What had I just done? Tattoos walked back to the booth, but the leader stood up. He approached the counter slowly, like a cat stalking a mouse. "What did you say?" I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. I said please leave her alone. She doesn't want to be bothered." He leaned across the counter close enough that I could smell the coffee on his breath. "And who's going to stop us? You..." My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. But I stood my ground. "There are security cameras," I lied, gesturing to the corners of the diner. "And I've already called the police." For a long moment he just stared at me. I was certain he was going to reach across the counter and grab me. But then he laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "You got guts, kid. I'll give you that." He turned to his friends. "Come on, boys. This place is dead anyway." They filed out, but not before the leader turned back to me. "We'll be seeing you around, sweetheart." The bell jingled as they left, and I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. My legs felt like jelly, and I had to grip the counter to stay upright. The young woman at the counter looked at me, her eyes wide. "Thank you," she said softly. "I don't know what I would have done if..." I nodded, still too shaken to speak. She left soon after, leaving me alone in the diner. For the rest of my shift, I jumped at every sound, certain that the men were going to come back. When my replacement arrived at 6 a.m., I nearly cried with relief. I thought that would be the end of it, just another crazy night story to tell my friends. But a week later, I was walking to my car after a late shift, when I saw a familiar figure leaning against it. The leader of the group, his predatory smile gleaming in the dim parking lot light. "Told you we'd be seeing you around, sweetheart," he said. I froze, my keys clutched in my hand like a weapon. "What do you want?" He pushed off the car and took a step towards me. "Just wanted to finish our conversation from the other night. You see, my friends and I, we don't like being disrespected." I backed away, looking around frantically for help, but the parking lot was empty, and the diner was dark. I was alone. "Look," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't want any trouble. I was just doing my job." He laughed, the sound sending chills down my spine. "Trouble? Oh, sweetheart. Trouble is just getting started." I saw movement out of the corner of my eye and realized with horror that we weren't alone. The other 4 men emerged from the shadows surrounding me. In that moment, I knew I had a choice to make. I could cower, beg for mercy, and hope they'd leave me alone. Or I could fight. I chose to fight. With all my strength, I swung my bag at the leader's head. It connected with a satisfying thud, and he stumbled backward. Taking advantage of their surprise, I bolted, running faster than I ever had in my life. I could hear them shouting, their footsteps pounding behind me. But fear and adrenaline propelled me forward. I ran out of the parking lot and down the street, my lungs burning and my heart threatening to burst from my chest. I didn't stop until I reached a 24-hour convenience store. I burst through the doors, gasping for air, and yelled for the clerk to call the police. The next few hours were a blur of police statements and questions. They found my car vandalized, all 4 tires slashed. But of the men, there was no sign. I quit my job at the diner the next day. It wasn't worth the risk. For weeks after, I jumped at every shadow, constantly looking over my shoulder. I invested in pepper spray and a home security system. Slowly, life began to return to normal. But I never forgot that night. It taught me something important about myself, that when pushed to the edge, I had the courage to stand up for what was right. It was a hard lesson, one that could have cost me dearly. But it also showed me a strength I didn't know I possessed. Now, years later, I still think about those men sometimes. I wonder if they're still out there, terrorizing other late-night diners or unsuspecting women. But I also think about that young woman at the counter, and how a simple act of standing up to bullies might have saved her from something terrible. I may not work the night shift anymore, but I carry that experience with me. It reminds me that even in the darkest moments, we have a choice. We can give in to fear, or we can find the courage to stand up for ourselves and others. It's not always easy, and it's certainly not always safe, but in the end, it's what defines us. And me? I choose to be the person who stands up, no matter how scary the night may seem. The moment I saw his eyes in my rearview mirror, I knew I'd made a terrible mistake. They weren't the eyes of someone coming to help. They were the eyes of a predator who'd just found his prey, and I was trapped on a deserted highway with him, miles from anywhere. It had started as a simple road trip. I was driving cross-country to start a new job, my car packed with everything I owned. The freedom of the open road, the promise of a fresh start. It all felt like an adventure. Until my car started making a worrying noise somewhere in the middle of nowhere, Kansas. I'd been driving for hours, the landscape an endless sea of wheat fields under a vast empty sky. The sun was setting, painting the horizon in brilliant oranges and pinks, when I first heard the rattling. It started soft, barely noticeable over the hum of the engine and the radio, but as the miles ticked by, it grew louder, more insistent. I tried to ignore it at first. I was on a tight schedule, and the thought of being delayed by car trouble made my stomach churn. But when white smoke started billowing from under the hood, I knew I couldn't put it off any longer. Cursing under my breath, I eased the car onto the shoulder. The rattling had become a full-blown clatter, and the engine gave one final sputtering cough before dying completely. Great, just great. I got out, popping the hood and waving away the acrid smoke. I didn't know much about cars, but even I could tell this was bad. The engine was a mess of hoses and metal, all looking equally foreign and unhelpful. I was way out of my depth. Sighing, I pulled out my phone. No signal. Of course. The sun had dipped below the horizon now, the twilight deepening rapidly. In the gathering darkness, the empty highway suddenly felt a lot less peaceful and a lot more menacing. I shivered, though the evening was still warm. That's when I saw the headlights approaching. My heart leapt. Maybe this wasn't a disaster after all. I waved my arms, feeling a rush of relief as the car and old pickup truck slowed and pulled over behind me. A man got out, tall and broad-shouldered. In the dim light, I could make out a scruffy beard and a worn baseball cap. He approached with an easy smile. "Car trouble?" he asked, his voice a deep rumble. I nodded, gesturing helplessly at the smoking engine. "It just died on me. I don't suppose you know anything about cars?" He chuckled. "Maybe a thing or two. Mind if I take a look?" I stepped aside, watching as he leaned over the engine. He poked and prodded, muttering to himself. After a few minutes, he straightened up, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Well, the good news is, it's not unfixable," he said. "Bad news is, you're gonna need a part I don't have on me. There's a town about 30 miles up the road with an auto shop. I could give you a ride if you want." I hesitated. Every instinct screamed that getting into a car with a stranger on a deserted highway was a bad idea. But what choice did I have? I couldn't stay here all night, and who knew when another car might come along? "That would be great, thank you," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "I really appreciate it." He smiled again, but this time something about it made my skin crawl. "Happy to help. Grab what you need and hop in." I quickly grabbed my purse and phone from my car, locking it out of habit. As if anyone would steal it out here. The man was already in his truck, engine idling. I climbed into the passenger seat, the old springs creaking under my weight. "I'm John, by the way," he said as he pulled back onto the highway. "Sarah," I replied, buckling my seatbelt. "Thanks again for stopping. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come along." John nodded, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "It's dangerous out here for a young woman all alone. Never know what kind of people you might run into." Something in his tone made me glance over sharply. His face was half in shadow, but I could see a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. It wasn't a kind smile. An uncomfortable silence fell. I found myself wishing he'd turn on the radio, anything to break the growing tension. But the only sound was the rumble of tires on asphalt and my own heartbeat, which seemed to be getting louder by the second. "So," I said, desperate to fill the silence, "do you live around here?" John shook his head. "Nah, just passing through, like you." "Oh, where are you headed?" He turned to look at me then, and in the green glow of the dashboard lights, his eyes seemed to glitter with something dark and hungry. "Wherever the road takes me." I felt a chill run down my spine. I turned to look out the window, trying to hide my growing unease. The landscape outside was pitch black now, no signs of life or civilization anywhere. We could have been the only two people left in the world. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. We'd been driving for at least 20 minutes, but the odometer hadn't budged. We weren't going towards town. We were going in circles. John?" I said, my voice shaking slightly. "I think we might have missed a turn or something. Shouldn't we have reached the town by now?" He didn't respond, just kept driving, that small, unsettling smile still on his face. "John," I said again, louder this time. "Did you hear me? We need to turn around." In one swift motion, he reached over and locked the doors. The sound of the locks clicking into place was like a gunshot in the quiet cab. "Now, Sarah," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Why would I want to do that? We're just getting to know each other." Panic surged through me. This couldn't be happening. This was the stuff of nightmares, of cautionary tales. This didn't happen in real life, not to me. But it was happening. And I knew with terrifying certainty that if I didn't do something right now, I might not live to see morning. I glanced around frantically, looking for something, anything I could use as a weapon. My purse was at my feet. Inside was a small canister of pepper spray my mom had insisted I carry. If I could just reach it without him noticing. "You know," John was saying, his tone conversational as if we were old friends catching up. "I've been driving this stretch of road for years. You'd be amazed how many pretty young things I've helped out. Always so grateful, so trusting." I forced myself to stay calm, to keep him talking while I slowly, inch by inch, moved my hand towards my purse. "And what happened to them?" I asked, afraid of the answer but needing to keep him distracted. He laughed, a sound that sent shivers down my spine. Oh, they're still around, parts of them anyway, scattered across these fields, feeding the wheat that feeds the nation. Poetic, don't you think? My fingers closed around the pepper spray. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what I had to do. You know what I think? I said. He turned to look at me, eyebrow raised. What's that, sweetheart? In one fluid motion, I raised the pepper spray and emptied the entire canister into his face. John howled in pain and anger, the truck swerving violently. I braced myself against the dashboard as we careened off the road, bumping over uneven ground before coming to a jarring stop. I didn't wait. I unlocked the door and threw myself out of the truck, hitting the ground hard. Pain shot through my shoulder, but adrenaline pushed me to my feet. I ran. I ran like I'd never run before, my lungs burning and my heart pounding. I could hear John behind me shouting threats that made my blood run cold, but I didn't look back. I just ran. I don't know how long I ran for. It felt like hours. My legs were on fire, each breath a stabbing pain in my chest, but fear kept me going, pushing me far beyond what I thought I was capable of. Finally, mercifully, I saw lights in the distance, a gas station, its fluorescent glow a beacon of hope in the darkness. I stumbled towards it, relief flooding through me as I saw people, cars, signs of life and safety. I burst through the door, startling the sleepy-looking clerk. "Please," I gasped, "call the police. There's a man. He tried to..." I couldn't finish the sentence. The adrenaline was wearing off, and the full weight of what had almost happened hit me like a truck. I collapsed onto the floor, shaking and sobbing. The next few hours passed in a blur. Police arrived, took my statement. They found my car where I'd left it, towed it to a local garage. Of John, there was no sign. They told me they'd keep looking, but the grim looks on their faces told me they didn't have much hope of finding him. As dawn broke, I sat in a small-town diner nursing a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. I was alive. I had survived. But I knew I'd never be the same. The open road, once a symbol of freedom and possibility, now felt threatening. Every stranger was a potential danger. The world had become a much darker, scarier place. But I had also discovered a strength in myself I never knew I had. When faced with unimaginable terror, I had fought back. I had survived. As I watched the sun rise over the Kansas wheat fields, I made a promise to myself. I would not let fear rule my life. I would be cautious, yes, but I would not let one evil man rob me of my sense of adventure, my trust in humanity. I started my car, freshly repaired, and pulled back onto the highway. The road stretched out before me, full of possibilities and, yes, potential dangers, but I was ready to face whatever came my way. Because sometimes the most important journeys are the ones that show us who we really are, and I had discovered I was a survivor. The alley loomed before me, a dark maw in the neon-lit city night. I knew I shouldn't take the shortcut, but I was already late for my shift at the diner. Just this once, I thought. What could go wrong? As the shadows swallowed me whole, I realized I was about to find out exactly how much. I'd been working the night shift at Mel's Diner for about 6 months. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills while I finished my degree. Usually, I gave myself plenty of time to make the 20-minute walk from my tiny apartment to the diner. But tonight, I'd lost track of time studying for a big exam, and now I was running late. The main streets were still busy, even at this hour. Cars honked, music blared from bars, and the sidewalks were dotted with people enjoying the warm summer night. Any other time, I might have appreciated the city's vibrant nightlife. But right now, all I could think about was how Mel would chew me out if I was late again. That's when I saw it. The alley, a narrow gap between two buildings that I knew would cut at least 5 minutes off my walk. I'd always avoided it before, heeding my mother's warnings about dark alleys and stranger danger. But tonight, desperation overcame caution. I took a deep breath and plunged into the darkness. The noise of the main street faded almost immediately, replaced by an eerie quiet broken only by the occasional drip of water and the scurry of unseen creatures. The air felt thick and close, heavy with the smell of garbage and something else I couldn't quite identify. I quickened my pace, my footsteps echoing off the narrow walls. The faster I got through this, the better. I was about halfway through when I heard it. Another set of footsteps, heavier than mine, coming from behind. My heart rate spiked, but I told myself to stay calm. It was probably just someone else taking a shortcut. Nothing to worry about. But then I heard another set of footsteps, and another. I risked a glance over my shoulder and my blood ran cold. 3 men were following me, their faces hidden in shadow but their intent clear in the predatory way they moved. I walked faster, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. The exit of the alley seemed impossibly far away. I could hear the men behind me picking up their pace too, no longer trying to be subtle. "Hey, sweetheart," one of them called out, his voice rough and mocking. "Where are you off to in such a hurry?" I didn't respond, just kept walking, my eyes fixed on the distant glow of the street ahead. Maybe if I ignored them, they'd leave me alone. But then I felt a hand grab my arm, yanking me backwards. I spun around, coming face to face with my pursuers. Up close, I could see them clearly. 3 men, all bigger than me, with hard eyes and cruel smiles. "Didn't your mama teach you it's rude to ignore people?" The one holding my arm sneered. His breath reeked of alcohol and cigarettes. I tried to pull away, but his grip tightened. "Please," I said, hating how small and scared my voice sounded. "I'm late for work. I don't want any trouble." They laughed, the sound echoing off the alley walls. "Hear that, boys?" the leader said. "She doesn't want any trouble. Well, ain't that just too bad?" Fear coursed through me, making it hard to think. I knew I should scream, run, fight, do something. But I felt paralyzed like a rabbit caught in a trap. The man holding me pushed me against the wall, his face inches from mine. "Now why don't you hand over that pretty little purse of yours, and maybe we'll let you go." I clutched my bag tighter, knowing it contained not just my wallet but also my textbooks, my notes, everything I needed for my exam tomorrow. "No," I said, surprised by the firmness in my voice. His eyes narrowed. "No, I don't think you understand the situation here, sweetheart. We're not asking." He reached for my bag, but something in me snapped. Maybe it was the fear, maybe it was anger at being cornered like this. But suddenly I was done being the victim. I brought my knee up hard, catching him right in the groin. He let out a pained grunt and doubled over. Not wasting a second, I shoved past him and ran. I could hear shouts behind me, footsteps pounding on the pavement, but fear and adrenaline propelled me forward faster than I'd ever run before. The end of the alley was in sight now, the bright lights of the main street a beacon of safety. Just a little further. A hand grabbed the back of my shirt, yanking me backwards. I stumbled, nearly falling, but managed to keep my feet under me. I spun around, coming face to face with one of the men. His eyes were wild with anger, his hand raised to strike. Without thinking, I swung my bag with all my might. The heavy textbooks connected with the side of his head with a satisfying thud. He staggered back, dazed. I turned and ran again, my lungs burning and my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. I could see people on the main street now, oblivious to the drama unfolding in the alley. "Help!" I screamed as I burst out onto the sidewalk. "Someone help me!" Heads turned, people stopped in their tracks, and behind me I heard the sound of retreating footsteps as my attackers melted back into the shadows of the alley. A couple rushed over to me, the woman putting a comforting arm around my shoulders while the man peered down the alley, phone in hand as he called the police. It was over. I was safe. The next hour passed in a blur of police statements and concerned questions. By the time I finally made it to the diner, I was over an hour late for my shift. But when Mel saw my tear-streaked face and the police officer accompanying me, his usual gruff demeanor softened. "Good Lord, kid," he said, ushering me to a booth. "Forget about your shift. You sit down and I'll get you some coffee." As I sipped the hot, strong coffee, my hands still shaking slightly, I couldn't stop thinking about how differently the night could have ended. If I'd been a little slower, a little weaker, a little more afraid. But I hadn't been. When it mattered most, I'd found a strength I didn't know I had. I'd fought back. I'd survived. The police never caught the men who attacked me, but in the days and weeks that followed, I refused to let fear rule my life. I took self-defense classes, started carrying pepper spray, and yes, I avoided dark alleys. But I also kept walking to work, kept pursuing my dreams, kept living my life, because I'd learned something important that night. The world can be a dangerous place, full of shadows and threats, but we're stronger than we know. And sometimes the most important thing we can do is refuse to be a victim. I still think about that night sometimes when I'm walking home late or passing a dark alley. I remember the fear, the desperation, the surge of adrenaline, but mostly, I remember the moment I decided to fight back, the moment I discovered my own power. It's a lesson I carry with me always, a reminder that even in our darkest moments, we have the strength to light our own way, that no matter how scary the shadows might be, we don't have to let them consume us. And now, years later, when I pass that alley on my way to my office, no more late-night diner shifts for me. I don't feel fear. I feel proud of the scared young woman who refused to be a victim, proud of how far I've come since that night. Because in the end, it's not about avoiding the dark alleys of life. It's about knowing that when we find ourselves in them, we have the power to fight our way out. And that knowledge, that inner strength, is a light that no shadow can extinguish. There's a man. He tried to. I couldn't finish the sentence. The adrenaline was wearing off, and the full weight of what had almost happened hit me like a truck. I collapsed onto the floor, shaking and sobbing. The next few hours passed in a blur. Police arrived, took my statement. They found my car where I'd left it, towed it to a local garage. Of John, there was no sign. They told me they'd keep looking, but the grim looks on their faces told me they didn't have much hope of finding him. As dawn broke, I sat in a small-town diner nursing a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. I was alive. I had survived. But I knew I'd never be the same. The open road, once a symbol of freedom and possibility, now felt threatening. Every stranger was a potential danger. The world had become a much darker, scarier place. But I had also discovered a strength in myself I never knew I had. When faced with unimaginable terror, I had fought back. I had survived. As I watched the sun rise over the Kansas wheat fields, I made a promise to myself. I would not let fear rule my life. I would be cautious, yes, but I would not let one evil man rob me of my sense of adventure, my trust in humanity. I started my car, freshly repaired, and pulled back onto the highway. The road stretched out before me, full of possibilities and, yes, potential dangers, but I was ready to face whatever came my way. Because sometimes the most important journeys are the ones that show us who we really are, and I had discovered I was a survivor. The moment I heard the crash downstairs, I knew this wasn't going to be an ordinary babysitting gig. The Thompsons had seemed like such a normal couple when they hired me. But as I huddled in the dark with their two terrified children, I realized just how wrong I'd been. It was supposed to be an easy night. The Thompsons were new to the neighborhood, and when they asked if I could watch their kids while they went to a work event, I jumped at the chance. Extra cash is always welcome when you're trying to save up for college. They seemed like the perfect family. Mr. Thompson was a successful businessman, always dressed in crisp suits. Mrs. Thompson had that polished look of a woman who frequented yoga classes and charity luncheons. And their kids, Emma and Jake, were adorable, if a bit shy. The evening started normally enough. I arrived at 7 p.m., got the usual rundown of bedtimes and emergency numbers. Mrs. Thompson seemed a bit on edge, but I chalked it up to new mom jitters about leaving the kids with a sitter for the first time. "Remember, don't answer the door or the phone," Mr. Thompson said as they were leaving. There was an intensity in his eyes that struck me as odd, but I nodded and assured him everything would be fine. For the first few hours it was. I played board games with Emma and Jake, made them dinner and got them ready for bed. It was just after 9 p.m. and I was settling in to watch some TV when I heard it. A loud crash from downstairs, followed by the sound of breaking glass. My heart leapt into my throat. Had someone broken in? Should I call the police? But before I could decide, I heard heavy footsteps on the stairs. Without thinking, I ran to the kids' rooms. Emma was already awake, her eyes wide with fear. "What's happening?" she whispered. "I don't know, sweetie," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "But we need to be very quiet, okay? Can you do that for me?" She nodded, clutching her stuffed rabbit to her chest. I scooped her up and hurried to Jake's room. He was still asleep, and for a moment, I envied his peaceful ignorance. But we couldn't stay here. I shook him awake gently, pressing a finger to my lips to signal silence. He blinked up at me in confusion, but didn't make a sound. Good kid. The footsteps were getting closer. I ushered the children into the walk-in closet in the master bedroom, my mind racing. What was happening? Who was in the house? We huddled in the dark, the only sound our shallow breathing and the pounding of my heart. Through a crack in the door, I could see a sliver of the bedroom. A shadow passed by and I held my breath. Come out, wherever you are," a gruff voice called. It wasn't Mr. or Mrs. Thompson. This was a stranger, and he sounded angry. Emma whimpered softly, and I pulled her closer, silently praying she wouldn't make another sound. Jake was trembling beside me, his eyes wide with fear. The intruder was in the bedroom now. I could hear him rummaging through drawers, muttering to himself. "Where is it? They said it would be here." My mind was spinning. Who was this man? What was he looking for? And why did he think it would be in the Thompsons' house? Suddenly a cell phone rang. The intruder cursed, then answered. "Yeah? No, I can't find it. The place is empty." "What do you mean check the kids' rooms? There aren't supposed to be any kids here." My blood ran cold. How did he know about the kids' rooms? And why did he think the house should be empty? The call ended, and I heard the intruder's heavy footsteps moving towards the closet. I held my breath, my arms tightening around Emma and Jake. This was it. We were going to be found. But then, miraculously, another sound cut through the silence. Sirens, growing louder by the second. The intruder swore loudly, and I heard him run from the room, thundering down the stairs. I waited, counting to 60 in my head before I dared to move. "Stay here," I whispered to the kids. "I'm going to check if it's safe." Cautiously, I crept out of the closet and peered out the window. Police cars were pulling up outside, their lights painting the quiet suburban street in flashes of red and blue. The front door was wide open, but there was no sign of the intruder. I grabbed the house phone from the bedside table and dialed 911, my hands shaking. "There's been a break-in," I said when the operator answered. "I'm the babysitter. I'm here with 2 children. We're upstairs, and I think the intruder has left, but I'm not sure if it's safe to come down." The operator assured me that officers were already inside the house and that someone would be up to get us soon. True to her word, moments later a police officer appeared in the doorway, his gun drawn but pointed at the floor. "It's okay," he said gently. "You're safe now. Can you come out slowly?" I called the kids out of the closet and we were escorted downstairs. The living room was a mess, furniture overturned, pictures knocked off the walls. But all I cared about was that we were safe. As one officer took my statement, another approached with a grim expression. "We need to ask you some questions about the Thompsons," he said. My stomach dropped. "What about them? Are they okay?" The officer sighed. "Ma'am, I'm afraid the Thompsons aren't who they said they were. Their real names are David and Sarah Connors. They're wanted for embezzlement and fraud in 3 states. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. But what about the kids?" "The children are safe," he assured me. "But I'm afraid they're not actually the Connors kids. They were kidnapped 6 months ago from their real parents in Ohio." The room spun around me. I sank onto the couch trying to process this information. The perfect family I thought I knew was a complete lie. And those poor children. Over the next few hours, the full story came out. The Connors, or Thompsons, had been running a complex financial scam for years. They'd stolen millions and were always one step ahead of the law. The kidnapped children were part of their cover, a way to appear like a normal, upstanding family. The man who broke in was working for some of the people they'd scammed, looking for evidence. He hadn't expected anyone to be home, which is why the Connors had been so insistent that I not answer the door or phone. They knew someone might be coming for them. As for Emma and Jake, whose real names turned out to be Lily and Max, they were reunited with their actual parents the next day. The joy and tears on their faces as they hugged their real mom and dad is something I'll never forget. In the aftermath, I was hailed as a hero for protecting the children, but I didn't feel like a hero. I felt naive and foolish for not seeing through the Connors charade. And I felt heartbroken for Lily and Max, whose world had been turned upside down not once but twice. The experience changed me. I became more cautious, more observant. I learned that appearances can be deceiving, and that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who look the most normal. But I also learned about my own strength. When it mattered most, I had kept my cool and protected those kids. I had faced a terrifying situation and come out the other side. Now, years later, I still think about that night sometimes. I wonder about Lily and Max, hoping they found happiness with their real family. I think about the Connors, serving time in federal prison, and I wonder if they ever felt guilty about the lives they destroyed. Most of all, I think about how quickly an ordinary night can turn into something extraordinary, and how we never really know what secrets might be lurking behind closed doors. I still babysit occasionally, but now I always trust my instincts. If something feels off, I pay attention. Because I learned the hard way that sometimes the real danger isn't the stranger breaking in, it's the people who invited you in the first place. That night taught me that bravery isn't about not being scared. It's about doing what needs to be done even when you're terrified. It's about protecting those who can't protect themselves, and sometimes it's about facing the darkness and emerging stronger on the other side. I may not be the same naive girl who walked into the Thompsons' house that night, but I'm stronger, wiser, and more prepared for whatever life might throw my way. And in the end, that's a lesson worth learning, even if the teaching of it was more terrifying than I ever could have imagined. The crack of the rifle shot echoed through the forest, freezing me in my tracks. This was supposed to be a peaceful hike, a chance to clear my head and enjoy nature. Instead, I found myself witness to something I was never meant to see, and now I was running for my life. I've always been an outdoors person. Growing up in a small town nestled against the Appalachian Mountains, I spent more time in the woods than I did in my own backyard. So when life in the city started to feel overwhelming, I knew exactly where to go to recharge. I took a week off work and drove out to my favorite national forest. The plan was simple: 5 days of solitary hiking, camping under the stars, and forgetting about deadlines and office politics. I should have known that nothing in life ever goes according to plan. The first 2 days were perfect. The weather was crisp but sunny. The autumn leaves a riot of red and gold. I hiked deep into the backcountry, far from the tourist trails and crowded campsites. Out here, it was just me, the trees, and the occasional curious deer. On the third day, I decided to explore a new area. The trail was barely visible, more of a game path than anything maintained by the Park Service. But I was confident in my navigation skills and the GPS on my phone. Besides, the thrill of discovering something new was part of why I came out here. It was late afternoon when I heard the first gunshot. I froze, confused. Hunting wasn't allowed in this part of the forest, and it wasn't hunting season anyway. Maybe it was just a park ranger dealing with a problem animal. But then I heard voices, gruff and angry, carried on the wind. Something about the tone made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. This wasn't official park business. Something was very wrong. Curiosity warred with caution. The smart thing would have been to turn around and head back the way I came. But I've never been accused of always doing the smart thing. Moving as quietly as I could, I crept towards the voices. The forest thinned out into a small clearing. Crouching behind a large oak, I peered out at a scene that made my blood run cold. 3 men stood in the clearing, all carrying rifles. But it wasn't the guns that horrified me. It was the bodies at their feet. 2 deer, clearly killed out of season, and something much larger covered by a tarp. "Hurry up and get it loaded," one of the men growled. "We need to be out of here before any rangers come sniffing around." As they moved to lift the tarp, it shifted, revealing what was underneath. I had to clamp my hand over my mouth to stifle a gasp. It wasn't a deer. It was a bear. A massive grizzly, its fur matted with blood. Poachers. I was witnessing illegal poachers in action. My mind raced. I needed to document this, to report it. As slowly and quietly as I could, I reached for my phone. If I could just get a picture. The snap of a twig under my foot sounded like a gunshot in the quiet forest. 3 heads whipped in my direction. "What was that?" one of the men said, raising his rifle. I didn't wait to see if they'd spot me. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush with none of the stealth I'd used to approach. Behind me, I heard shouts and then, terrifyingly, the sound of pursuit. "Get him," a voice roared. "Don't let him get away." Fear gave me wings. I sprinted through the forest, ducking under branches and leaping over fallen logs. But I could hear them behind me, gaining ground. They knew these woods too. And they were motivated by more than just the thrill of the chase. A rifle shot cracked the air, splintering bark off a tree inches from my head. They were shooting at me. This wasn't about catching a witness anymore. They were trying to eliminate me. I veered sharply to the left, hoping to throw off their aim. My lungs were burning, my legs felt like lead, but I didn't dare slow down. I just needed to reach my campsite. I had a satellite phone there. I could call for help. But in my panic, I'd lost my bearings. Nothing looked familiar. I was running blind, driven purely by the need to get away. Another shot, closer this time. I felt something hot graze my arm and looked down to see a tear in my jacket, blood welling up from a shallow cut. The reality of my situation hit me like a physical blow. These men were going to kill me if they caught me. I burst through a thicket and found myself at the edge of a steep ravine. Far below, I could hear the rush of a river. For a moment, I froze, unsure which direction to take. The sound of my pursuers was getting closer. Making a split-second decision, I began to scramble down the ravine. It was steep and treacherous, loose rocks sliding under my feet. More than once, I nearly lost my footing, saved only by grabbing onto exposed roots or small trees. I could hear the poachers at the top of the ravine now, shouting to each other. They'd lost sight of me in the dense undergrowth. I pressed myself against the rocky slope, trying to control my ragged breathing. "He must have gone down," one of them said. "You two go around, cut him off at the bottom. I'll follow his trail." My heart sank. They were going to trap me. I looked down at the river, churning white water over rocks. It was a long drop and the current looked deadly. But what choice did I have? Taking a deep breath, I pushed off from the ravine wall and half ran, half slid down the slope. Rocks clattered down around me, giving away my position. I heard a shout from above, followed by another gunshot, but I was moving too fast, too erratically for them to get a clear shot. I hit the water feet first, the icy shock driving the air from my lungs. The current immediately grabbed me, pulling me under. For a terrifying moment, I was completely disoriented, tumbling in the freezing water. Then survival instinct kicked in and I fought my way to the surface, gasping for air. The river carried me swiftly downstream, away from the poachers. I could hear their frustrated shouts fading behind me, but I wasn't safe yet. The water was treacherous, full of hidden rocks and swirling eddies. More than once I was pulled under, each time fighting my way back to the surface with increasing desperation. Finally, the river widened and slowed. With the last of my strength, I managed to swim to the bank and drag myself out of the water. I lay there on the rocky shore, coughing and shivering for what felt like hours. As the adrenaline wore off, the reality of my situation set in. I was soaking wet in near freezing temperatures. Night was falling. I had no idea where I was, and somewhere out in these woods were 3 armed men who wanted me dead. My phone was gone, lost in the river. I had nothing but the clothes on my back and whatever I had in my pockets. But I was alive, and as long as I was alive, I had a chance. Forcing myself to my feet, I took stock of my surroundings. The river had carried me far from where I'd first encountered the poachers, but I couldn't assume I was safe. They might still be searching for me. I needed to find help, to report what I'd seen. But more immediately, I needed to survive the night. Hypothermia was a real risk in my wet clothes. Moving as quickly as my battered body would allow, I gathered what dry wood I could find. My waterproof matches were still in my pocket, a small miracle. Soon I had a small fire going, hidden in a natural depression to avoid detection. As I huddled by the meager warmth, trying to dry my clothes, I replayed the events of the day in my mind. The image of that dead bear haunted me. How long had these poachers been operating here? How many animals had they killed? I knew I couldn't let them get away with it. Somehow I had to make it back to civilization and report what I'd seen. But first I had to survive. The night was long and cold. Every snapping twig made me jump, convinced the poachers had found me. But dawn came, and with it, renewed determination. I set out at first light, following the river downstream. Civilization had to be somewhere in that direction. My body ached. I was hungry and still damp, but I pushed on. The thought of those men continuing their illegal hunting drove me forward. It was late afternoon when I finally heard the sound of voices. Not the gruff shouts of the poachers, but the cheerful chatter of hikers. I nearly cried with relief. The hikers were shocked to see me, dirty, bruised, and wild-eyed. They gave me food and water, and one of them had a satellite phone. Within hours, I was in a ranger station, telling my story to increasingly wide-eyed officials. The aftermath was a whirlwind of police statements, Park Service investigations, and media attention. They found my abandoned campsite and, guided by my description, the poachers' killing ground. The men were arrested a week later trying to sell the bear parts on the black market. I was hailed as a hero by conservation groups, but I didn't feel like one. I had simply been in the right place at the wrong time, and then done what anyone would do, run for my life. The experience changed me, though. I still love the outdoors, still feel most at home under an open sky. But now I'm more aware of the darker side of human nature, the greed that would destroy something as magnificent as that bear for profit. I go back to those woods sometimes. Not to the exact spot, I don't think I'll ever be ready for that. But to remind myself of what's at stake. To remember that sometimes doing the right thing means taking a risk. And to appreciate the wild places we have left and the importance of protecting them. Because in the end, that's what it's all about. Not the fear or the chase or even the narrow escape. It's about standing up for something bigger than yourself, even when it's dangerous, even when it's terrifying. Because if we don't, who will? The beam of my flashlight caught a pair of wild, desperate eyes, and in that moment, I knew I'd made a terrible mistake. The man I'd rescued from the churning waves wasn't a victim of the storm. He was a predator, and I'd just invited him into my sanctuary. I've been the keeper of the Mockingbird Point Lighthouse for nearly a decade. It's a solitary life, but one that suits me. I've always preferred the company of the sea and the cry of gulls to the chaos of the city. Most days, my biggest challenge is keeping the light burning bright and the windows clean of salt spray. But that night was different. The storm had been brewing for days, a monster of a system that had the weather service issuing dire warnings up and down the coast. I'd battened down the hatches, made sure the emergency generator was fueled up, and settled in for a long night of vigilance. The wind howled around the tower, rain lashing against the windows with such force I half expected them to shatter. Waves crashed against the rocks below, their roar a constant backdrop to the storm's fury. It was the kind of night that reminded you of nature's awesome, terrifying power. I was up in the lantern room, making sure the light was steady, when I saw it, a flicker of movement in the churning sea below. At first I thought it was debris, maybe part of a broken boat, but then I saw an arm wave, and my heart leapt into my throat. There was someone out there. I didn't stop to think. I grabbed my emergency kit and rain gear and rushed down the spiral staircase, taking the steps two at a time. The wind nearly knocked me off my feet as I burst out of the lighthouse door, but I leaned into it, making my way down the treacherous path to the small cove below. The waves were massive, crashing over the breakwater and sending spray high into the air. I could barely make out the figure in the water being tossed about like a rag doll. How he'd ended up out there I couldn't imagine, but I knew he wouldn't last long in these conditions. I'm a strong swimmer. You have to be in this job. But even I hesitated at the edge of the water. It would be suicide to go in after him. Instead, I uncoiled the rescue rope from my kit and began to swing it over my head. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice nearly lost in the storm. "Over here, grab the rope." I saw him turn towards me, fighting against the current. I threw the rope with all my might, praying it would reach him. The first attempt fell short, but on the second try I saw his hands close around it. "I've got you," I yelled, bracing myself against a rock and beginning to pull. It was like trying to haul in a whale. The combination of his waterlogged weight and the pull of the tide was almost more than I could manage. My muscles screamed in protest, but I gritted my teeth and kept pulling. Inch by agonizing inch, I dragged him toward shore. As he got closer, I could see he was a large man, easily 6 feet tall and solidly built. How he'd managed to stay afloat in these conditions was a miracle. Finally, his feet found purchase on the rocky bottom. He staggered the last few yards, collapsing onto the shore like a beached whale. I rushed to his side, my training kicking in as I checked for injuries. "Are you hurt?" I had to shout to be heard over the storm. "Can you walk?" He nodded, coughing up seawater. I helped him to his feet, supporting much of his weight as we made our way back up to the lighthouse. By the time we stumbled through the door, we were both soaked to the bone and gasping for breath. "Thank you," he managed between coughs. "I thought I was done for out there." "Let's get you warmed up," I said, leading him to the small living quarters attached to the base of the lighthouse. "Then you can tell me how you ended up in that mess." I got him settled in front of the potbelly stove, wrapping him in blankets and pressing a mug of hot tea into his hands. As the color began to return to his face, I took a moment to really look at him. He was younger than I'd first thought, probably in his early 30s. His face was all hard angles with a strong jaw and deep-set eyes. There was something intense about him, a coiled energy that seemed at odds with his near-drowning experience. I'm Jack, I said, realizing I hadn't introduced myself. I'm the lighthouse keeper here. He nodded, taking a long sip of tea before answering. Tom, he said simply. Thanks again for the save. So, Tom, I said, settling into a chair across from him. Want to tell me what you were doing out in that storm? A shadow passed over his face, there and gone so quickly I almost thought I'd imagined it. Fishing boat, he said. Got caught in the storm. I got thrown overboard. It was a plausible story, but something about it didn't sit right with me. His clothes didn't look like a fisherman's, for one thing, and there was something in his eyes, a wariness that spoke of more than just a brush with death. But I didn't press. He'd been through an ordeal after all. There'd be time for more questions later. Well, you're safe now, I said, standing up. The storm's supposed to blow over by morning. I'll radio the Coast Guard then. Let them know you're here. They can send someone to pick you up. He nodded, but I saw his hands tighten on the mug. Thanks, he said. I appreciate all you've done. I showed him to the small guest room we kept for the occasional inspector or maintenance worker. Try to get some rest, I said. Shout if you need anything. As I closed the door behind me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. But I pushed the thought aside. I had a lighthouse to run, storm or no storm. The night wore on, the storm gradually losing its fury. I made my rounds, checking the light and the equipment, always aware of my unexpected guest just a few rooms away. It was nearing dawn when I heard it, a soft creak of floorboards that didn't match the usual sounds of the lighthouse. I froze, listening intently. There it was again, closer this time. I turned slowly to see Tom standing in the doorway of the watchroom, his expression unreadable in the dim light. Everything okay? I asked, fighting to keep my voice casual. Need something? He took a step forward, and I noticed for the first time that he was holding something. My blood ran cold as I realized it was the heavy wrench from my toolkit. I'm sorry, Jack, he said, his voice low and intense. I can't let you make that call to the Coast Guard. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. He wasn't a fisherman. He was running from something or someone. Look, I said, raising my hands placatingly. I don't know what kind of trouble you're in, but we can figure this out. You don't have to do anything rash. He laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. You don't understand. There's no figuring this out. I'm in too deep. He took another step forward and I backed up, my mind racing. I was trapped up here in the lantern room, a steep spiral staircase the only way down. If it came to a physical confrontation, I didn't like my odds against him. Just let me go, he said. Forget you ever saw me. I'll find my own way off this rock. I shook my head. You know I can't do that, Tom. Whatever you're mixed up in, turning yourself in has got to be better than adding assault or worse to your charges. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. But then his expression hardened. I'm not going back, he growled. I can't. He lunged forward suddenly, the wrench arcing through the air towards my head. I ducked, feeling the wind of its passage ruffle my hair. Off balance, he stumbled past me, crashing into the railing that surrounded the light. Without thinking, I threw myself at him, grabbing for the wrench. We grappled, teetering dangerously close to the edge. The storm had died down, but this high up, the wind was still fierce, pulling at our clothes and drowning out our grunts of effort. I managed to get a hand on the wrench, trying to pry it from his grip. He was stronger than me, but I was fighting for my life, desperation lending me strength. Suddenly, his foot slipped on the wet floor. I saw the moment of panic in his eyes as he lost his balance, tipping backwards over the railing. His hand shot out, grabbing my shirt, and for one terrifying moment, I thought he was going to pull me over with him. But then his grip loosened, and he was falling, a cry of terror torn from his throat as he plummeted towards the rocks below. I stood there, frozen in horror for what felt like an eternity. The wrench slipped from my numb fingers, clattering to the floor. Slowly, as if in a dream, I made my way down the stairs and out of the lighthouse. The storm had passed, the first light of dawn painting the sky in pastel hues. It was beautiful, peaceful, a stark contrast to the violence of moments before. I found Tom's body on the rocks, broken and still. The tide was coming in, waves already lapping at his feet. Soon the sea would claim him, erasing all evidence of the night's events. For a long moment I stood there, the weight of what had happened pressing down on me. Then, moving as if on autopilot, I made my way back to the lighthouse and placed a call to the Coast Guard. "This is Mockingbird Point," I said, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. "I need to report an accident." The official investigation ruled it just that, an accident. An unfortunate soul swept overboard in the storm dashed against the rocks in an attempt to find safety. Only I knew the truth, and I've carried that burden ever since. I still tend the lighthouse at Mockingbird Point, still find peace in the rhythm of the waves and the cry of the gulls, but now, on stormy nights when the wind howls around the tower, I find myself watching the water with wary eyes. Because I've learned that sometimes the real danger isn't in the storm itself. Sometimes it's in the desperate souls it washes up on your shore. The moment I saw the gun, I knew I'd stumbled into something far more dangerous than a simple case of mistaken identity. What I didn't know was that this dingy motel room was about to become the stage for a nightmare I couldn't have imagined in my wildest dreams. It was supposed to be a quick overnight stay, just a place to catch some sleep before continuing my cross-country drive. The Sleepy Pine Motel wasn't much to look at, a rundown relic from the 1950s that had seen better days. But it was cheap, and I was tired. That's how I justified it to myself anyway. The night clerk barely looked up from his ancient TV as he handed me the key to room 7. "Check-out's at 11, he grunted, already turning his attention back to whatever late-night infomercial was playing. I shouldered my overnight bag and made my way across the cracked parking lot. The neon vacancy sign flickered weakly, casting an eerie red glow over the weathered doors. A cat yowled somewhere in the darkness, making me jump. Room 7 was exactly what I expected. Musty, with peeling wallpaper and a bed that had seen better decades. But it was a place to sleep, and that's all I needed. I tossed my bag on the chair, kicked off my shoes, and was about to flop onto the bed when I heard it. Voices, angry and urgent, coming from outside. Curiosity got the better of me. I crept to the window and peered through a gap in the dusty curtains. 3 men were gathered around a black SUV in the parking lot. Even in the dim light, I could see they were agitated, gesturing wildly as they argued in hushed tones. "Wasn't supposed to go down like this," one of them was saying. "We need to lay low, regroup." "Lay low?" another spat. "With half the state cops on our tail, we need to get out of here now." I leaned closer, straining to hear more. But in my eagerness, I bumped the rickety bedside table. The cheap lamp wobbled, then crashed to the floor with a sound that seemed deafening in the quiet night. The voices outside stopped abruptly. I froze, heart pounding. Please, I thought, let them think it was just the wind or that damn cat. No such luck. Heavy footsteps approached my door. I had just enough time to straighten up and take a step back before it burst open, revealing 2 of the men from outside. Both were carrying guns. "Well, well," the taller one said, his voice cold. "Looks like we've got ourselves an eavesdropper." I raised my hands, trying to keep my voice steady. "Look, there's been a misunderstanding. I'm just passing through. I didn't hear anything." "Save it." The other man cut me off. He jerked his head towards the door. "Outside. Now." They marched me across the parking lot to their SUV. The third man was waiting there, a scowl etched on his face. "Who's this?" he demanded. "Found him listening in," tall guy said. "In room 7. The third man's eyes narrowed. "Room 7? That's not possible. That was supposed to be empty, reserved for us." A chill ran down my spine as I realized the gravity of my situation. These weren't just some rough characters having an argument. They were criminals expecting a safe house, and I had unknowingly taken their room. "Please," I said it. "This is all a mistake. I'm not who you think I am. I'm just a traveler. I stopped here for the night." "Shut up," the third man snapped. He seemed to be the leader. "Check his ID." Rough hands rifled through my pockets, pulling out my wallet. They flipped it open, examining my driver's license. "David Cooper," tall guy read aloud. "From Ohio." The leader's eyes bored into me. "Is that your real name? Or is it an alias?" "It's my real name," I insisted. "I swear I'm not involved in whatever this is. I'm just passing through on my way to California. New job. I can show you the offer letter." "Enough!" The leader cut me off. He turned to the others. "Get him in the car. We need to move." Panic surged through me. Wait, no, you can't just take me. People will notice I'm missing. There'll be questions. The leader's laugh was cold and humorless. Trust me, kid. By the time anyone realizes you're gone, we'll be long gone. And you? Well, let's just say you'd better hope you're as innocent as you claim. They shoved me into the back seat of the SUV, tall guy sliding in beside me while the other two got up front. As we peeled out of the parking lot, I caught a glimpse of the night clerk still glued to his TV, oblivious to the drama unfolding just outside. We drove for what felt like hours, the landscape outside fading from sparse town to empty desert. I tried to keep track of turns, to memorize landmarks, but it was useless. In the pitch black of the desert night, everything looked the same. Finally, we turned onto a dirt road, bouncing and jolting for several miles before coming to a stop in front of a ramshackle cabin. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, windows boarded up and roof sagging ominously. They hustled me inside, flicking on a single bare bulb that cast harsh shadows across the dusty interior. A table, a couple of chairs, and a sagging couch were the only furniture. "Sit," the leader commanded, pointing to one of the chairs. As I sank into it, he loomed over me, his expression unreadable. "Now, David Cooper from Ohio, you're going to tell us exactly who you are and who you're working for. And for your sake, I hope you're a damn good liar." My mind raced. They thought I was some kind of plant, maybe an undercover cop or a rival criminal. The truth, that I was just an ordinary guy in the wrong place at the wrong time, seemed too unbelievable. But I knew that lying would only make things worse when they inevitably caught me out. So I told them everything. About my boring IT job in Ohio, the offer from a tech startup in San Francisco, my decision to drive cross-country to see America before settling into my new life. I even told them about the girl I'd left behind, Katie, and how we'd decided a long-distance relationship was better than no relationship at all. As I talked, I watched their faces. The leaders remained impassive, but I saw flickers of doubt in the others' eyes. Maybe, just maybe, they were starting to believe me. When I finished, there was a long silence. Then the leader spoke. "If you're telling the truth, and that's a big if, then you've had one hell of a run of bad luck, kid." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. He continued, "But here's the problem. We can't just let you go. You've seen our faces. You know too much. Even if you are just some random schmuck, that's too big a risk." My heart sank. This was it. They were going to kill me, bury me out here in the desert where no one would ever find me. But then tall guy spoke up. "Boss, what if we keep him with us? Just until the heat dies down and we can make the exchange. Then we let him go somewhere far away. By the time he could talk to anyone, we'd be long gone." The leader considered this, his eyes never leaving my face. "And if he tries to run? Or if he's not as innocent as he claims?" Tall guy shrugged. "Then we do what we have to do. But at least this way we're not killing some civilian for no reason." I held my breath, hardly daring to hope. After what felt like an eternity, the leader nodded. "All right, but he's your responsibility. He tries anything, it's on you." Relief washed over me, quickly followed by a new wave of fear. I wasn't going to die, at least not immediately. But I was now a hostage to a group of dangerous criminals, with no idea what they were involved in or how long they planned to keep me. The next few days passed in a blur of tension and fear. We moved frequently, never staying in one place for more than a night. I gathered that they had pulled off some kind of heist and were waiting to exchange their stolen goods for money. But the heat from the police was intense, forcing them to lay low. I was never left alone, always under the watchful eye of at least one of them. They didn't trust me, but as the days wore on, they began to relax slightly around me. I learned their names. The leader was Frank, tall guy was Bobby, and the third man was Tommy. It was Tommy who finally told me what they'd stolen, a collection of rare gems from a private collector. The job was supposed to be simple, in and out with no violence. But something had gone wrong, and now they were in deeper than they'd ever intended. As I listened to Tommy talk, a plan began to form in my mind. It was risky, potentially suicidal, but it was also my only chance at freedom. On the fifth night, we were holed up in another abandoned building, this time an old gas station. Frank and Bobby had gone to meet their contact, leaving Tommy to watch me. I waited until Tommy's attention was focused on the police scanner they kept running, then made my move. I lunged for the gun he kept tucked in his waistband. He was faster than I expected, though, and we ended up grappling on the floor. He was stronger than me, but I was fighting for my life. Somehow in the struggle, my hand closed around the grip of the gun. There was a deafening bang, and suddenly Tommy went limp. I scrambled back, staring in horror at the growing red stain on his shirt. I hadn't meant to pull the trigger. I hadn't meant to kill him, but there was no time for regret. I could hear a car approaching, Frank and Bobby returning. With shaking hands, I grabbed the keys to their SUV and ran. I drove for hours, not daring to stop, expecting at any moment to see headlights in my rearview mirror, but no one came after me. As dawn broke, I finally pulled over at a truck stop, using a payphone to call the police. The aftermath was a whirlwind of police statements and FBI interviews. The stolen gems were recovered, Frank and Bobby were arrested, and I was hailed as a hero in the press. But I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like a survivor, someone who had walked through fire and emerged forever changed. Now, years later, I still think about those 5 days sometimes, about how quickly an ordinary life can be turned upside down, how thin the line is between safety and danger. I'm more cautious now, more aware of the shadows that lurk at the edges of our civilized world. But I'm also more appreciative of the simple things, a safe place to sleep, the freedom to go where I want. And every time I pass a rundown motel on a lonely highway, I say a little prayer of thanks that I'm just passing by. Because you never know when a simple overnight stay might turn into the fight of your life. The first warning sign should have been the way the locals clammed up whenever I mentioned my father's name. But I was too caught up in the novelty of inheriting a house to notice the undercurrent of fear that rippled through this small Tennessee town. It wasn't until I found the hidden room in the basement that I realized just how deep my father's secrets ran, and how dangerous they could be for me. I never really knew my dad. He left when I was just a kid, sending the occasional birthday card or Christmas gift, but never making much of an effort to be part of my life. So when I got the call that he had passed away and left me his house and his will, I was more surprised than grief-stricken. The lawyer described it as a modest property in a quiet town, which sounded perfect to me. I'd been feeling burnt out in my corporate job in the city, and the idea of a change of pace was appealing. Plus, free house. Who could say no to that? I arrived in Millbrook on a sunny Tuesday afternoon. The town was exactly what you'd expect from small-town America. A main street lined with mom-and-pop shops, a diner that looked like it hadn't changed since the 1950s, and more churches than you'd think necessary for a population of just over 5,000. My dad's house was on the outskirts of town, a 2-story colonial with peeling white paint and a slightly overgrown lawn. It wasn't much to look at, but it was mine. I spent the first day cleaning and exploring, trying to get a sense of the man my father had been through the possessions he'd left behind. That's when I started to notice things, little oddities that didn't quite add up, like the fact that there were no family photos anywhere in the house, not even of me, or the way the bookshelves were filled with dense texts on finance and international banking. Not exactly light reading for a man who, as far as I knew, had worked as a local handyman, but it was the safe that really piqued my curiosity. I found it hidden behind a painting in the study, a heavy-duty model that looked like it belonged in a bank rather than a private home. It took me 3 days to crack it, using every trick I'd learned from late-night YouTube binges. When it finally swung open, I wasn't prepared for what I found inside. Stacks of cash in various currencies, passports with my father's picture but different names, and a leather-bound ledger filled with columns of numbers and cryptic notations. I stayed up all night poring over that ledger, trying to make sense of it. By dawn, I had a sinking feeling in my stomach. These weren't the accounts of a small-town handyman. They were the records of someone involved in something much bigger and likely illegal. Determined to get to the bottom of things, I decided to start asking around town. That's when I noticed the second red flag, the way people reacted to my father's name. Conversations would stop abruptly. Shopkeepers would suddenly remember urgent errands. Even the chatty waitress at the diner clammed up when I mentioned I was old Jim Cooper's boy. It was clear that my father had been more than just the town hermit. He had been feared. I was mulling this over one evening, nursing a beer on the front porch, when a car pulled up in front of the house. A man got out, tall, well-dressed, with the kind of confidence that comes from being used to people doing what you tell them. "You must be Jim's kid," he said as he approached. There was something in his tone that set me on edge. "I'm Frank. I was a..." business associate of your father's. I invited him in, more out of a desire to get answers than any real hospitality. As we sat in the living room, Frank's eyes darted around, taking in every detail. "I'll cut to the chase," he said finally. "Your dad owed me something. I'm here to collect." My pulse quickened. "I'm afraid I don't know anything about my father's business dealings," I said carefully. Frank's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Come on now, smart guy like you. I bet you've already found the safe, the ledger. Am I right?" I tried to keep my face neutral, but something must have given me away because Frank nodded, satisfied. "Here's the deal," he continued. "Your dad was holding something for me, a USB drive. It's got some sensitive information on it. I need it back." "And if I don't have it?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Frank's expression hardened. "Then we've got a problem, because that drive is worth a lot of money to some very dangerous people. And they're not as patient as I am." He stood up, straightening his jacket. "You've got 48 hours to find it. I'll be back. And kid, don't even think about running. We've got eyes on you." After Frank left, I sat in stunned silence for a long time. My mind was reeling, trying to process everything I'd learned. My father, the man I barely knew, had been involved in something big, something dangerous. And now, whatever it was, it had been dropped squarely in my lap. I spent the next day tearing the house apart, looking for any sign of the USB drive Frank had mentioned. I checked every drawer, every hiding spot I could think of. I even pried up floorboards, half expecting to find a secret compartment. But there was nothing. It wasn't until late that night, as I was about to give up, that I noticed something odd about the basement stairs. One of the risers sounded hollow when I stepped on it. Heart pounding, I pried it up, and there it was. A small USB drive tucked away in a space carved out of the wood. I rushed to my laptop, hands shaking as I plugged it in. The drive was encrypted, of course, but after hours of work, I managed to crack it. What I found made my blood run cold. Financial records, offshore accounts, evidence of money laundering on a massive scale, and names, so many names, politicians, business leaders, even a few celebrities, all tied up in what looked like a sprawling criminal enterprise. I realized then the true weight of what I'd inherited. This wasn't just a house and some mysterious business dealings. This was evidence that could bring down some very powerful people. People who wouldn't hesitate to silence anyone who threatened them. As dawn broke, I made a decision. I couldn't run. Frank had made it clear I was being watched. I couldn't go to the police. Who knew how deep this corruption ran? There was only one thing I could do. I spent the next day preparing. I made copies of the drive's contents, hiding them in various locations. I wrote down everything I knew, sealing it in envelopes to be mailed to investigative journalists if anything happened to me. And I prepared myself for Frank's return. When he showed up, right on schedule, I was ready. "Did you find it?" he demanded as soon as I opened the door. I nodded, leading him into the study. The USB drive was sitting on the desk, innocuous and small for something that had caused so much trouble. Frank's eyes lit up when he saw it. He reached for it, but I was faster, snatching it away. "Not so fast," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. "We need to talk terms." Frank's expression darkened. "Terms, kid? You don't get to dictate terms. Just hand it over and we'll call it square." I shook my head. "I've seen what's on this drive. I know what it could do to you, to all of you. So here's how this is going to work. You're going to leave me alone. No more threats, no more watching my every move. In exchange, this drive and everything on it stays secret." Frank's hand twitched towards his jacket, and for a heart-stopping moment, I thought he was going to pull out a gun. But then he relaxed, a slow smile spreading across his face. "You've got guts, kid. Your old man would be proud." He considered me for a long moment. "All right, you keep your mouth shut, we leave you alone. But if I get even a hint that you're thinking about going public..." "You won't," I assured him. "As long as you hold up your end of the bargain." After Frank left, I sat in my father's chair for a long time, the weight of everything that had happened settling over me. I had just blackmailed a criminal organization. I was now the keeper of secrets that could destroy lives and topple empires. In the span of a week, I had gone from a regular guy to... what? A reluctant criminal? A keeper of dangerous knowledge? I wasn't sure. What I did know was that my life would never be the same. The quiet town of Millbrook no longer seemed so quaint and peaceful. Every friendly smile now held the possibility of hidden motives. Every passing car could be watching, waiting. I thought about leaving, about walking away from this house and all its secrets, but I knew I couldn't. Whatever my father had been, whatever he had done, this was now my responsibility, my burden to bear. As night fell, I locked the USB drive away in the safe, wondering not for the first time what other secrets this old house might be hiding. And as I climbed the stairs to bed, I realized that I was no longer just my father's son. I was his heir in every sense of the word. And God help me, I had no idea what that truly meant. The moment our tires hit that unmarked dirt road, I knew we'd made a terrible mistake. The air seemed to thicken, the shadows deepened, and an uneasy silence fell over our once lively group. Little did we know, our detour was about to turn our carefree road trip into a nightmare that would haunt us for years to come. It was supposed to be the adventure of a lifetime. 5 friends, fresh out of college, embarking on a cross-country road trip before we all settled into our real lives. We'd spent months planning it, mapping out routes, bookmarking quirky roadside attractions, and creating the perfect playlist for our journey. I was behind the wheel that fateful day, with my best friend Sarah riding shotgun. In the back, Mike and Lisa were cuddled up together, while Jack sprawled across the rest of the seat, occasionally piping up with bad jokes or requests to stop for snacks. We were somewhere in the southwest, surrounded by endless stretches of desert and scrubland. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, when our GPS suddenly went haywire. "Guys, I think we're lost," I said, squinting at the unhelpful screen. Sarah peered at the map on her phone. "There should be a turn coming up that'll take us back to the highway, maybe a mile or two ahead." That's when we saw it. A narrow dirt road branching off to the right. It didn't look like much, but it was the first turn we'd seen in hours. "That's gotta be it," Mike said from the back seat. "Take it." I hesitated. Something about the road felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on why. "I don't know, guys. Maybe we should keep going, find a more main road." "Come on, where's your sense of adventure?" Jack chimed in. "It'll be fine. Worst case, we can always turn back." Outvoted and not wanting to seem like a killjoy, I made the turn. The smooth asphalt gave way to bumpy dirt, kicking up dust that obscured our view in the fading light. We drove for what felt like hours, the landscape growing more desolate with each passing mile. The playful chatter that had filled the car all day slowly died out, replaced by an uneasy silence. Even Jack stopped cracking jokes. It was fully dark when we saw the first sign of civilization, a flickering light in the distance. As we got closer, we could make out the shape of a small gas station, its weathered sign barely legible in the gloom. "Thank God," Lisa murmured. "Maybe we can get directions." I pulled up to the single pump, the gravel crunching under our tires. The place looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1950s, all rusty metal and peeling paint. A lone fluorescent bulb buzzed over the entrance, attracting a cloud of moths. "I'll go in and ask," I said, unbuckling my seatbelt. "You guys wait here." As I stepped out of the car, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The air felt wrong somehow, too still and heavy. I could feel eyes on me, though when I looked around I saw no one. The bell over the door jangled as I entered, making me jump. The interior was dimly lit and cluttered, shelves stocked with dusty cans and faded packages. Behind the counter stood an old man, his face a mass of wrinkles and his eyes sharp beneath bushy brows. "Evening," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We're a bit lost. Hoping you could point us back to the highway." The old man stared at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was like gravel. "You shouldn't be here." A chill ran down my spine. "I'm sorry. This ain't a place for outsiders," he continued. "Best turn around and go back the way you came. Quick as you can." Before I could respond, the bell jangled again. I turned to see Sarah standing in the doorway, her face pale. "We need to go," she said urgently. Now, I hurried out after her, my heart pounding. "What's wrong?" She pointed to a beat-up truck that had pulled up beside our car. 2 men were circling it slowly, peering in the windows. Even from a distance, I could see the menace in their posture. We rushed back to the car, Mike had his arm around Lisa, who looked close to tears. Jack was sitting up straight, all traces of his usual laid-back demeanor gone. "Drive," Sarah hissed as we got in. "Just drive." I didn't need to be told twice. I gunned the engine, tires squealing as we peeled out of the gas station. In the rearview mirror, I saw the two men run back to their truck. "They're following us," Jack said, his voice tight with fear. I pressed harder on the accelerator, taking the winding dirt road at a dangerous speed. The truck stayed right on our tail, its headlights filling our car with harsh light. "What do they want?" Lisa cried. "Why are they chasing us?" None of us had an answer. We were just 5 college kids, with nothing of value except maybe our phones and the little cash we had for the trip. This didn't feel like a simple robbery. There was something more sinister at play. We drove for what felt like hours, the truck never more than a few car lengths behind us. Every time I thought we might be losing them, they'd surge forward, nearly clipping our bumper. Then, without warning, our engine began to sputter. "No, no, no," I muttered, watching in horror as the temperature gauge crept into the red. We'd been pushing the car too hard, and now it was giving out. With no other choice, I eased off the gas, letting the car coast to a stop at the side of the road. The truck pulled up behind us, its engine idling ominously. "What do we do?" Sarah whispered, her hand finding mine in the darkness. Before anyone could answer, the truck's doors opened. 3 men got out, the 2 from the gas station, plus a third larger man who seemed to be in charge. They approached our car slowly, spreading out to surround us. "Out of the car," the leader growled, tapping on my window with what looked distressingly like a hunting knife. We exchanged terrified glances, then slowly got out, huddling together in front of our disabled vehicle. The men formed a loose semicircle around us, cutting off any chance of escape. "Well, well," the leader said, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "What do we have here? 5 little lambs lost in the big bad woods?" "Please," I said, trying to keep my voice from shaking. "We don't want any trouble. We're just trying to get back to the highway." He laughed, a harsh sound that sent chills down my spine. "Oh, there's no highway where you're going. You see, we don't get many visitors out here, and when we do, well, we like to make sure they stick around for a while." The implications of his words hit us like a physical blow. This wasn't a robbery. This was something far worse. What followed was a nightmare beyond anything I could have imagined. They herded us into the back of their truck, ignoring our pleas and protests. We were taken to a ramshackle compound deep in the wilderness where more people waited. Men, women, and even children, all with the same feral look in their eyes. For days, we were held captive, separated and subjected to a terror that I still struggled to put into words. They seemed to delight in our fear, in breaking us down piece by piece. I lost track of time, of how many times I prayed for rescue or even for the sweet release of death. But even in the darkest moments, a spark of defiance remained. We may have been naive college kids, but we weren't going down without a fight. Slowly, carefully, we began to plan. It was Sarah who created the distraction, faking a seizure that drew most of our captors' attention. Mike managed to steal a set of keys, and Jack, good old dependable Jack, hot-wired one of their trucks while Lisa and I took out the guards. Our escape was chaos, a mad dash through the compound, bullets whizzing past our heads as we piled into the stolen truck. I was behind the wheel again, driving like I never had before, fueled by desperation and the primal need to survive. By some miracle, we made it. We found a main road, flagged down a passing motorist, and finally got the help we so desperately needed. The police swarmed the area, but our captors had vanished, leaving behind only the haunting evidence of their twisted games. In the months and years that followed, we tried to piece our lives back together. Therapy helped, as did the unbreakable bond forged between the 5 of us through our shared trauma. But some scars run too deep to ever fully heal. I still can't look at a map without my hands shaking. Sarah flinches at the sound of engines idling. Mike and Lisa broke up, unable to look at each other without remembering the horrors we endured. And Jack never jokes anymore. We were just 5 friends looking for adventure. Instead, we found the darkest corner of humanity, a place where the rules of civilization don't apply. We survived, yes, but a part of us will always be back there, trapped on that lonely desert road, praying for a rescue that we thought would never come. So if you're ever on a road trip and you see that unmarked dirt road beckoning with the promise of a shortcut or an adventure, keep driving. Some detours are not worth taking. Some adventures are better left unexplored. And some nightmares, once awoken, can never truly be put back to sleep. The moment I saw the flicker of movement on the security camera, I knew this night shift was about to become anything but routine. In the world of data security, paranoia is just another word for vigilance. But nothing could have prepared me for the night when that paranoia proved justified, and I found myself in a life-or-death game of cat and mouse with intruders who would stop at nothing to get what they came for. I've been working as a night security guard at Quantum Data Solutions for the past 3 years. It's not the most glamorous job, but it pays well and usually involves nothing more exciting than endless rounds of solitaire and lukewarm coffee. QDS is one of those companies that most people have never heard of, but whose services are used by just about every major corporation and government agency. They specialize in data storage and security, handling the kind of information that could topple economies or start wars if it fell into the wrong hands. That's why security is tight biometric scanners, armed guards during the day, and a state-of-the-art surveillance system that I monitor during the graveyard shift. Most nights, the scariest thing I see is the occasional rat scurrying across the parking lot. But not tonight. It started like any other shift. I arrived at 11 p.m., relieved the evening guard, and settled into my chair in the control room. The wall of monitors in front of me showed every angle of the facility. Parking lots, corridors, server rooms, even the roof. I did my first round of checks, then poured myself a cup of coffee and prepared for another uneventful night. Around 2 a.m., something caught my eye. A shadow moved across one of the exterior cameras, too quickly to be a trick of the light. I leaned in, scanning each monitor carefully. There it was again, a dark figure darting between cars in the employee parking lot. My heart rate picked up. This wasn't normal. I zoomed in on the camera, trying to get a better look. The figure was dressed all in black, face obscured by a mask. And they weren't alone. I counted at least 3 others, all moving with the kind of precision that screamed, professional. I reached for the phone to call the police, but hesitated. False alarms were taken seriously here. If I was wrong, it could cost me my job. I needed to be sure. I switched to the interior cameras, holding my breath as I watched the entrance. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, so subtly I almost missed it, the light on the card reader flicked from red to green. The door opened, and the shadows slipped inside. My blood ran cold. These weren't ordinary burglars. They had somehow bypassed our security system, which was supposed to be unhackable. This was big. I snatched up the phone, fingers trembling as I dialed 911. "This is Quantum Data Solutions," I said as soon as the operator answered. "We have a break-in in progress. Multiple armed intruders. Send everyone." The operator assured me help was on the way, but I knew it would take time. The facility was isolated, at least 20 minutes from the nearest police station. I was on my own. I watched the monitors intently as the intruders made their way through the building. They moved with purpose, clearly familiar with the layout. My suspicion that this was an inside job grew stronger. They were heading straight for the main server room, the heart of QDS, where the most sensitive data was stored. I had a decision to make. Company protocol said to stay put, monitor the situation, and wait for the police. But every instinct I had was screaming that if these guys got into that server room, it would be too late. I had to do something. Taking a deep breath, I pulled up the facility's security controls on my computer. As a last line of defense, I had the ability to initiate a complete lockdown. Every door would seal, every elevator would freeze. It would trap the intruders, yes, but it would also trap me. My finger hovered over the button. This was way above my pay grade. I was just a security guard, not some action hero. But then I saw the intruders reach the door to the server room, and I knew I was out of time. I hit the button. Alarms blared throughout the facility as thick metal shutters slammed down over every exit. On the monitors, I saw the intruders freeze, then quickly regroup. They were professionals, after all. They'd come prepared for complications. Now the real cat and mouse game began. I had locked them in, yes, but I'd also locked myself in with them. And they knew someone was controlling the building. It wouldn't take them long to figure out where the control room was. I needed a plan. The control room was secure, but it wouldn't hold forever against determined attackers. I had to find a way to keep them from the servers and stay alive until help arrived. First things first. I needed to level the playing field. I killed the lights in the entire building, plunging everything into darkness. The intruders had night vision gear, I was sure, but this would slow them down. I, on the other hand, had every camera's infrared mode at my disposal. I could see them, but they couldn't see me. I watched as they regrouped, communicating via hand signals. 3 of them continued towards the server room, while one peeled off, heading in my direction. My palms were sweaty as I tracked his progress. He was methodical, checking each room he passed. Time for the next phase of my hastily constructed plan. I pulled up the building's environmental controls. With a few keystrokes, I activated the fire suppression system in the corridor leading to the server room. There was no fire, of course, but the intruders didn't know that. Clouds of CO2 flooded the hallway, obscuring even infrared vision. I allowed myself a small smile as I watched the 3 intruders by the server room stumble back, coughing and disoriented. But my victory was short-lived. The 4th member of their team had reached the corridor outside the control room. My heart pounded as I watched him examine the door. It was reinforced steel, designed to withstand an explosion. But the look of the door told him exactly what was behind it. He spoke into his radio, and I saw the other 3 change direction. They were all coming for me now. I had bought some time, but I was running out of tricks. The police had to be close. I just needed to hold out a little longer. Then I saw it, a small-shaped charge being placed on the control room door. They were going to blow their way in. Panic surged through me. I looked around frantically for anything I could use to defend myself. That's when my eyes fell on the ventilation grate in the corner of the room. It was small, but so was I. Without allowing myself to think too hard about it, I pried open the grate and wiggled inside. I had barely pulled the grate closed behind me when I heard the muffled thump of the explosion. Through the slats, I watched as the intruders stormed into the now empty control room. Their frustration was palpable as they realized their quarry had slipped away. But I wasn't out of danger yet. I was trapped in a ventilation shaft with 4 armed men searching for me, and I had no idea how much longer it would be before help arrived. I started crawling, trying to remember the building's layout. If I could make it to the loading dock, there was an emergency exit that would open even during a lockdown. It was a long shot, but it was all I had. The ventilation shaft was a maze of tight turns and intersections. More than once I found myself doubling back, acutely aware of how much noise I was making. The sound of the intruders searching for me echoed through the metal ducts, sometimes terrifyingly close. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, I saw light ahead, the grate overlooking the loading dock. I was almost there, but as I reached the grate, I heard voices directly below. 2 of the intruders were searching the area. I was trapped. Just as despair began to set in, another sound cut through the air. Sirens. The cavalry had finally arrived. The next few minutes were chaos. I heard shouts, gunshots, the sound of breaking glass. I stayed frozen in the vent, afraid to move until I was sure it was over. Finally, a new voice called out. Authoritative, official. "This is the police. The building is surrounded. Come out with your hands up." Relief flooded through me. It was over. We had won. The aftermath was a blur of police statements and debriefings. The intruders had been caught, it turned out, thanks in large part to my actions. The data was safe. I was hailed as a hero, given a commendation and a hefty bonus. But as the adrenaline faded and the reality of what had happened sank in, I found myself reevaluating a lot of things. The safety I'd taken for granted, the mundane nature of my job, it had all been an illusion. I still work at QDS, but now every shift is different. Every shadow on a monitor could be a threat. Every routine check could uncover something sinister. Some people might find that level of constant vigilance exhausting. But for me, it's a reminder. A reminder that sometimes the only thing standing between order and chaos, between safety and disaster, is one person willing to step up when it matters most. And so I sit in my control room, watching the monitors, ready for whatever the night might bring. Because in this line of work, paranoia isn't just an occupational hazard, it's a survival skill. The hiss of air escaping my slashed tires pierced the stillness of the night, and with it, my sense of security evaporated. As I peered out into the darkness, heart pounding, I realized that my peaceful camping trip had just become a desperate fight for survival. I've always been a bit of a loner, preferring the company of nature to the hustle and bustle of city life. That's why I invested in my camper van. a cozy little home on wheels that allowed me to escape whenever the urge struck. This particular trip was meant to be a week-long retreat in the mountains, a chance to clear my head and recharge my batteries. The first 2 days were perfect. I found a secluded spot off a rarely used forest road, surrounded by towering pines and with a view of the valley below that took my breath away. I spent my days hiking, reading, and simply soaking in the serenity of the wilderness. As night fell on the second evening, I felt more relaxed than I had in months. I was just drifting off to sleep, lulled by the gentle patter of rain on the van's roof, when I heard it, a sound that didn't belong. At first I thought it might be an animal, maybe a deer moving through the underbrush. But then I heard it again, closer this time. Footsteps. Human footsteps. My eyes snapped open, suddenly wide awake. I lay perfectly still, straining my ears. The footsteps circled the van slowly, deliberately. This was no lost hiker stumbling upon my campsite. Whoever was out there was trying very hard to be quiet and failing. I reached for my phone, cursing silently when I saw there was no signal. Of course there wasn't. That was part of why I'd chosen this spot. The isolation that had seemed so appealing just hours ago now felt suffocating. The footsteps stopped directly outside my window. I held my breath, heart hammering so loudly I was sure it could be heard outside. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then slowly a shadow passed across the window, a human figure peering in. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying that the darkness inside the van would conceal me. The shadow lingered for what felt like an eternity before finally moving away. I heard more movement outside, then a new sound that made my blood run cold, the unmistakable hiss of air escaping tires. Panic surged through me. I was trapped. Even if I managed to start the van and get away, I wouldn't get far on flat tires, and the nearest town was at least 30 miles away. I forced myself to think. I had supplies, food, water, a first aid kit. I had a hunting knife I kept for protection, though the thought of actually using it made me queasy. What I needed was a plan. Carefully, moving as quietly as I could, I peered out each window of the van. The figure was still out there, a dark shape moving at the edge of my limited vision. Just one, as far as I could tell. Small mercies. I weighed my options. I could stay in the van and hope they left, but that felt too passive. I could try to reason with them, but the methodical way they disabled my vehicle suggested they weren't interested in talking. That left confrontation or escape. The decision was made for me when I heard a new sound, the click of my van's lock being picked. My hands shaking, I grabbed my knife and moved to the back of the van, pressing myself into the darkest corner. The door opened with agonizing slowness. A figure stepped inside, backlit by the faint moonlight filtering through the trees. I could make out broad shoulders, a hood pulled low over their face. In their hand gleamed the unmistakable shape of a gun. My breath caught in my throat. This was really happening. This wasn't some random burglary or wrong place, wrong time scenario. This person had come prepared, had deliberately trapped me here. The realization sent a chill down my spine. The intruder moved further into the van, their free hand groping along the wall. They were looking for the light switch, I realized. In a few seconds, they'd find it, and I'd lose what little advantage the darkness gave me. I had to act now. Without allowing myself to think too hard about what I was doing, I lunged forward. The element of surprise was on my side. The intruder stumbled backwards, caught off guard. We grappled in the confined space, my knife against their gun. In the chaos, the gun went off. The sound was deafening in the small space of the van. I felt a searing pain in my arm, but adrenaline kept me moving. Somehow I managed to knock the gun from their hand. It clattered to the floor of the van, sliding out of reach. The intruder was strong, but I was fighting for my life. I managed to land a solid punch, feeling something crunch beneath my fist. They stumbled back, giving me the opening I needed. I dove for the driver's seat, fumbling for the keys I always left in the ignition. The engine roared to life, drowning out the intruder's shouts. I slammed the accelerator, not caring about the flat tires. I just needed to get away. The van lurched forward, the metal rims scraping against rock and dirt. The ride was rough, each bump sending jolts of pain through my injured arm, but I didn't dare slow down. In the rearview mirror, I could see the intruder stumbling after the van, but they were quickly left behind. I drove for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the van shuddering and groaning in protest. Finally, when I was sure I wasn't being followed, I allowed myself to stop. The adrenaline was wearing off, and the pain in my arm was becoming impossible to ignore. I switched on the interior light, wincing at the brightness. The bullet had grazed my upper arm, leaving a deep, bloody furrow. It hurt like hell, but I knew it could have been much worse. With shaking hands, I managed to bandage the wound using supplies from my first aid kit. Then, exhausted and in pain, I slumped in the driver's seat, trying to process what had just happened. Who was that person? Why had they targeted me? I ran through possibilities in my mind. Random crime, mistaken identity, some enemy from my past I'd forgotten about. None of it made sense. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, I knew I couldn't stay here. The van was a wreck, limping along on its ruined tires. I needed to find help, to report what had happened. But a part of me was reluctant to leave the safety of my little sanctuary, battered though it was. In the end, necessity won out. I gathered what supplies I could carry in a backpack: water, food, my phone, still without signal, and the first aid kit. With a last look at my beloved van, I set out on foot. The hike was grueling. My arm throbbed with every step, and the weight of the backpack seemed to increase with each passing mile. But fear kept me moving. For all I knew, the intruder was still out there searching for me. It was late afternoon when I finally stumbled onto a paved road. My relief was short-lived, though. There were no cars in sight, no signs of civilization beyond the weathered asphalt stretching out in both directions. I picked a direction at random and started walking. The sun was setting by the time I heard the most beautiful sound in the world, the rumble of an approaching engine. I turned to see a beat-up pickup truck coming my way. I must have looked a sight. Dirty, blood-stained, wild-eyed with exhaustion and lingering fear. But the elderly couple in the truck didn't hesitate to stop. Their kindness nearly undid me, and I found myself fighting back tears as I climbed into the truck bed. They took me to the nearest town, insisting on driving me straight to the small local hospital. The next few hours passed in a blur of police statements and medical treatments. My arm would heal, the doctors assured me. The psychological wounds I suspected would take longer. In the days and weeks that followed, as I recovered and tried to piece my life back together, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had fundamentally changed. The wilderness, once my refuge, now held an edge of danger I couldn't ignore. Every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat. Every unexpected sound sent my heart racing. They never caught the person who attacked me. The police had theories. A drifter preying on isolated campers, maybe. Or someone with a grudge against van life tourists. But no arrests were made, no real closure offered. I sold the van. I couldn't bear to look at it, couldn't imagine ever feeling safe in it again. But I couldn't quite bring myself to give up on the outdoors entirely. These days I stick to established campgrounds, always with other people nearby. I carry a satellite phone, and I've taken self-defense classes. Some might say the experience ruined me, took away the peace I used to find in solitude. But I prefer to think it made me stronger, more aware. I still find beauty in nature, still feel that pull towards the wild places. But now I go into them with open eyes, aware of both the wonder and the danger they hold. Because I learned the hard way that sometimes the most threatening predators aren't the four-legged kind. And in the wilderness, the line between peace and peril can be terrifyingly thin. The moment I saw the gun tucked into the waistband of the man's jacket, I knew this wasn't going to be an ordinary ferry crossing. What I didn't know was that by the end of the night, I'd be fighting not just for my own life, but for the lives of everyone on board. I've always loved ferry rides. There's something soothing about being on the water, watching the shoreline recede as you drift towards your destination. So when I had to travel for a business meeting, I opted for the overnight ferry instead of flying. It was cheaper, and I figured I'd get a good night's sleep in my cabin. The weather was turning nasty as we boarded. Dark clouds roiling overhead, the wind whipping up whitecaps on the water. But the captain assured us it was nothing the ferry couldn't handle. Just a bit of autumn storm, he said with a confident smile. I settled into my cabin, a small but comfortable space with a narrow bunk and a tiny porthole. As the ferry pulled away from the dock, I felt the familiar excitement of beginning a journey. I unpacked a few things, then decided to head up to the observation deck to watch our departure. That's when I first noticed him. A man in his 40s with close-cropped hair and a face that seemed permanently set in a scowl. He was standing near the railing, his eyes scanning the other passengers in a way that made me uneasy. But it was the bulge under his jacket that really caught my attention. The shape was unmistakable. A handgun. My heart rate picked up. Surely I was mistaken. Who brings a gun on a ferry? I tried to convince myself I was overreacting, that maybe it was just an oddly shaped phone or wallet. But deep down I knew what I'd seen. I must have been staring because suddenly his eyes locked onto mine. For a moment we just looked at each other. Then he smiled, a cold expression that didn't reach his eyes, and turned away. I retreated to my cabin, my mind racing. Should I report what I'd seen? But what if I was wrong? I didn't want to cause a panic over nothing. I decided to keep an eye on the situation and only say something if I saw anything else suspicious. As night fell, the storm intensified. The ferry creaked and groaned as it plowed through increasingly large waves. Most passengers had retreated to their cabins or the main lounge, seeking refuge from the wind and rain lashing the decks. Unable to sleep, I made my way to the lounge. It was about half full, with people reading, chatting quietly, or trying to doze in the comfortable chairs. I got a cup of coffee from the small cafe and found a seat near the window, watching the angry sea churn outside. That's when I saw them. The man with the gun, now accompanied by two others. They were huddled in a corner, speaking in low, urgent tones. As I watched, I saw one of them pass something to the others. It looked like a key card, the kind used for the crew areas of the ship. A chill ran down my spine. This was no coincidence. Whatever these men were planning, it wasn't good. I was trying to figure out what to do when a commotion near the entrance to the lounge caught everyone's attention. A woman was arguing with one of the ferry staff, her voice rising hysterically. "You don't understand," she was saying. "They're going to kill us all." The staff member was trying to calm her down, but she was beyond reasoning. "There's a bomb," she screamed. "We're all going to die." Chaos erupted in the lounge. People started panicking, pushing towards the exits. The three men I'd been watching seized the opportunity. In the confusion, they slipped out a side door, one that I was pretty sure led to the restricted areas of the ship. I had a split-second decision to make. I could join the panicking crowd, maybe find a crew member and try to explain what I'd seen. But something told me that by the time anyone listened, it would be too late. Taking a deep breath, I ducked through the same door the men had used. The passageway beyond was narrow and dimly lit. I could hear footsteps ahead and followed as quietly as I could. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure they'd hear it. I trailed them through a maze of corridors, going deeper into the bowels of the ship. Finally, they stopped outside a door marked Engine Room. One of them swiped the key card, and they disappeared inside. I crept closer, pressing my ear to the door. Their voices were muffled, but I could make out enough to turn my blood cold. "Timer set?" "Yeah, we've got 30 minutes." "Good. That'll put us about halfway between the mainland and the island. Maximum damage." My mind reeled. The hysterical woman had been right. There was a bomb, and these men were planning to sink the ferry with hundreds of innocent people on board. I had to do something. But what? I was just a businessman, not some action hero. I had no weapon, no training for this kind of situation. All I had was the element of surprise and the knowledge that if I didn't act, everyone on this ship was going to die. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The engine room was huge, a cavernous space filled with massive machinery. The noise was deafening, the air hot and thick with the smell of oil. It took me a moment to spot the men. They were huddled around something on the far side of the room. I crept closer, using the machinery for cover. As I got nearer, I could see what they were working on. It was a large device, bristling with wires and blinking lights. The bomb. One of the men straightened up, wiping his hands on his pants. "All right, it's armed. Let's get out of here." It was now or never. I looked around frantically for something I could use as a weapon. My eyes fell on a large wrench hanging on a nearby wall. I grabbed it, the weight reassuring in my hands. As the men turned to leave, I stepped out from behind the engine block. "Stop right there," I shouted, trying to sound more confident than I felt. They whirled around, shock turning quickly to anger on their faces. The one with the gun, the man I'd first noticed on deck, reached for his waistband. I didn't give him the chance. With all my strength, I hurled the wrench at him. It caught him square in the chest, sending him stumbling backwards. His gun clattered to the floor. The other two men rushed me. I managed to dodge the first one, but the second caught me with a solid punch to the jaw. I tasted blood as I staggered back. What followed was a brutal, desperate fight. I was outnumbered and outmatched, but I was fighting for my life, for everyone's lives. Somehow I managed to hold my own, landing a few good hits and using the cramped space of the engine room to my advantage. But I was tiring quickly. One of the men got me in a headlock, while another rained blows on my midsection. My vision was starting to blur when I heard a new sound cutting through the chaos, alarms blaring throughout the ship. The men froze. "Shit!" one of them cursed. Someone must have triggered the alarm. Their moment of distraction was all I needed. I broke free from the headlock, scrambling towards the fallen gun. My hand closed around it just as the man I'd hit with the wrench lunged for me. We grappled for the weapon, rolling on the grimy floor of the engine room. I was dimly aware of shouts in the corridor outside, the sound of running feet getting closer. With a final desperate surge of strength, I wrenched the gun free. Without thinking, I pulled the trigger. The gunshot was deafening in the confined space. The man fell back, clutching his shoulder. The other two raised their hands, realizing the game was up. Moments later, the engine room was swarming with crew members and security personnel. They took in the scene with wide eyes. The three subdued men, the bomb still blinking ominously in the corner, and me, bloodied and shaking, still holding the gun. The next few hours passed in a blur. The bomb was defused, the ferry diverted to the nearest port. There were police statements to give, medical examinations to endure. I learned that the woman in the lounge had overheard the men talking and raised the alarm, but in her panic, she'd been unable to give clear information. As dawn broke, I stood on the deck, watching the coast draw nearer. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky washed clean and bright. Fellow passengers kept coming up to thank me, to shake my hand or pat me on the back. I felt oddly detached from it all, still processing the night's events. A Coast Guard officer approached me, a satellite phone in his hand. "Sir, there's a call for you. It's the governor. He wants to thank you personally." I nodded, taking the phone. But as I raised it to my ear, my eyes were drawn to the horizon, where the sea met the sky. In that moment, I realized something profound had shifted within me. I had faced death and emerged victorious. I had saved lives. The ferry ride that was supposed to be a simple journey had turned into something far more. It had shown me depths of courage I never knew I possessed, and reminded me of the extraordinary potential that lies within ordinary people. As I began to speak to the governor, I knew that whatever challenges life might throw at me in the future, I would face them with a newfound strength and determination. Because sometimes the most unlikely heroes are forged in the crucible of necessity, rising to meet dangers they never expected to face. The shadows in this place have teeth. That's the thought that kept running through my mind as I huddled in the darkness of the caretaker's cabin, listening to the sounds of something moving outside, something that shouldn't be there, something that wanted in. I never should have taken this job. That's easy to say now, of course, with the benefit of hindsight. But 3 weeks ago, when I was drowning in student debt and facing eviction from my crappy apartment, the ad had seemed like a lifeline. Wanted, caretaker for Whispering Pines Lodge. Winter season. Must be self-reliant and comfortable with isolation. Good pay, room and board included. It had sounded perfect. A chance to get away from the city, to clear my head and maybe even work on that novel I'd been putting off for years. The interview had been brief, conducted over the phone with a gruff-voiced man who seemed more interested in whether I could handle basic maintenance than in my actual qualifications. Lodge is closed for the season, he'd explained. Just need someone to keep an eye on things, make sure pipes don't freeze, that sort of thing. Nearest town's about 30 miles away, so you'll be on your own most of the time. That gonna be a problem? I'd assured him it wouldn't be. I'd always been a bit of a loner anyway. The isolation sounded more like a perk than a drawback. Oh, how naive I'd been. The first week had been fine, idyllic even. Whispering Pines Lodge was a sprawling rustic retreat, nestled high in the mountains, surrounded by towering pine trees and breathtaking views. My duties were minimal. Check the pipes daily, keep the generator running, and make a log of any maintenance issues for when the lodge reopened in the spring. I spent my days exploring the grounds, reading by the massive stone fireplace in the main lodge, and yes, even working on my novel. The nights were peaceful, filled with the gentle whisper of wind through the pines and the occasional hoot of an owl. But then, things started to change. It began with small things. Items moved from where I'd left them, footprints in the snow that didn't match my boots. Once I could have sworn I heard whispers coming from one of the empty guest cabins, but when I investigated, there was nothing there. I told myself I was imagining things. The isolation was getting to me, that's all. I just needed to keep busy, to stick to my routine. But the incidents kept escalating. One morning I woke to find all the furniture in the main lodge rearranged. Another day I returned from my rounds to find every faucet in the caretaker's cabin running full blast, steaming hot water flooding the floors. And then there were the noises at night, scratching at the walls, heavy footsteps on the roof. Once a sound so much like a scream that I spent the entire night huddled in my bed, too terrified to move. I tried to call the lodge owners to tell them something was wrong, but the phone lines were down and my cell phone hadn't had service since I arrived. I was truly alone. That's when I found the journal. It was hidden in a false bottom of a drawer in the caretaker's cabin. The handwriting was shaky, urgent, as if the writer had been in a hurry or afraid. "They're real," it read. "All the stories, all the legends, they're all true. The things in the woods, the whispers in the night, they're hungry and they're angry. God help me, I think they want in." The journal went on, detailing increasingly terrifying encounters, shadows that moved against the wind, faces peering in windows that disappeared when looked at directly, and always, always, the sense of being watched. The final entry chilled me to my core. "I can't stay here anymore. They're getting bolder. Last night they almost got in. I'm leaving at first light. If you're reading this, whoever you are, get out. Get out now, while you still can, before they decide they're done playing games." I should have listened. Should have packed my bags and hiked out right then and there. But a stubborn part of me still wasn't ready to believe. It had to be a prank, right? Some kind of sick joke played by the previous caretaker. So I stayed. And now, as I sit here in the darkness, listening to the scratching at the door growing louder and more frenzied, I know I've made a terrible mistake. It started just after sundown. I was in the main lodge going through my evening checklist when the lights flickered and went out. The generator, I thought, must have run out of fuel. But when I went to check, I found the fuel tank full. There was no reason for the power to be out. That's when I heard it. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I ran back to the caretaker's cabin, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly as panic took hold. I barely made it inside before the first real assault began. Something heavy slammed against the door, making the whole cabin shudder. I could hear wood splintering, the hinges groaning under the strain, and the voices. Oh God, the voices. They started as whispers, barely audible over the sound of my own ragged breathing. But they grew louder, more insistent. Dozens of voices, maybe hundreds, all calling my name, all begging to be let in. I tried to block them out, to focus on finding a way out of this nightmare. But there was nowhere to go. The cabin was surrounded, and even if I could somehow get past whatever was out there, the forest at night was a death trap. I was trapped. Hours have passed now, though it feels like days. The attack comes in waves. Sometimes it's just the scratching, nails or claws dragging across the walls and windows. Other times it's the pounding, so violent I'm sure the cabin will come apart at any moment. And always, always, there are the voices. They've changed tactics now, no longer begging. They've started making promises, telling me all the wonderful things that await if I just open the door. Wealth, fame, power, anything I've ever wanted, they say, can be mine. But underneath the honeyed words, I can hear the hunger, the rage. These things, whatever they are, don't want to reward me. They want to devour me. I've barricaded myself in the bedroom for all the good it will do. I've gathered what meager weapons I could find, a fire poker, a kitchen knife, a can of bear spray I found in a closet. They feel pitifully inadequate against the forces arrayed outside. As I write this, huddled in the corner furthest from the door, I can hear them discussing new strategies. They're growing impatient. Soon, I think, they'll stop playing games and simply tear the cabin apart to get to me. I don't know if anyone will ever read this. I don't know if I'll survive until morning. But if by some miracle this journal is found, let it serve as a warning. The shadows in this place have teeth. The whispers in the pines are real, and they are hungry. If you're reading this, get out. Get out now while you still can. Don't make the same mistake I did. Don't ignore the signs. Don't let curiosity or stubbornness or desperation cloud your judgment. Because once the sun sets and the shadows lengthen, it will be too late. They'll be coming for you, just as they're coming for me now. I can hear the wood of the bedroom door starting to splinter. They're almost through. I don't have much time left. To whoever finds this, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I couldn't stop them. I'm sorry I couldn't warn you in time. Please be smarter than I was. Be safer. And whatever you do, don't listen to the whispers in the pines. Don't answer when they call your name. Because if you do, you'll be... The journal entry ends abruptly here, a long scratch mark trailing off the page. The shadows always seem longer at night, especially in a place like Oakwood Estates. As I made my rounds, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Maybe it was the way the wind whispered through the perfectly manicured hedges, or how the streetlights cast an eerie glow on the empty driveways. But then I saw him, a hooded figure, lurking outside the Thompson house. And that's when I knew this wasn't going to be just another quiet night on the job. I'd been working security at Oakwood Estates for about 6 months. It was a cushy gig, all things considered. The gated community was home to some of the city's wealthiest residents, and they paid good money to feel safe. Most nights, my biggest challenge was staying awake during the long, uneventful hours. But tonight was different. I'd first noticed the hooded figure around 11 p.m., standing motionless across the street from the Thompson place. At first, I thought it might be one of the residents coming home late, maybe having a smoke before heading inside. But as the hours ticked by and he remained in the same spot, barely moving, my unease grew. By 2 a.m., I couldn't ignore it anymore. I radioed back to the guardhouse. "Hey, Mike, you seeing this guy on the cameras?" There was a crackle of static, then Mike's voice came through. "Yeah, I've been watching him. Weird, right? Want me to call it in, eh?" I hesitated. We'd had false alarms before, jumpy residents calling about suspicious characters that turned out to be delivery drivers or landscapers working late. The last thing I wanted was to cry wolf. "Nah, I'll check it out myself first. Keep an eye on the feeds, okay?" "You got it, boss. Be careful out there." I approached slowly, my hand resting on the pepper spray at my belt. As I got closer, I could make out more details. The figure was tall, probably male, wearing a dark hoodie pulled low over his face. He was standing perfectly still, head tilted slightly as if listening for something. "Excuse me, sir," I called out, trying to keep my voice firm and authoritative. "This is a private community. Can I help you with something?" The figure turned slowly to face me, but said nothing. A chill ran down my spine as I realized I couldn't see his face at all, just darkness where features should be. I swallowed hard, fighting to keep my voice steady. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to state your business or leave the premises." For a long moment, there was silence. Then in a voice that sounded like gravel being crushed, he spoke. "I'm waiting." "Waiting for what?" I asked, my hand tightening on the pepper spray. He turned back to face the Thompson house. "For him to come home." Alarm bells were ringing in my head now. I knew John Thompson worked late sometimes, but this felt wrong. "Look, buddy," I said, taking a step closer. "I don't know who you are or what your deal is with Mr. Thompson, but you can't stay here. How about you come down to the guardhouse with me and we can sort this out?" The figure didn't move. "I can't leave. Not until it's done." My blood ran cold. "Until what's done?" But he didn't answer, just stood there staring at the house as still as a statue. I backed away slowly, then turned and hurried back to my patrol car. As soon as I was inside, I radioed Mike again. "Call the police," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "And get me everything we have on John Thompson. Now." While Mike made the call, I pulled up the resident database on my tablet. John Thompson, 45, lived alone, worked as a financial advisor, no reported incidents or complaints, nothing out of the ordinary. But as I scrolled through his file, something caught my eye. A note from 6 months ago, right around when I started working here. Resident requested additional security measures, reason not specified. The pieces started to fall into place. The way Thompson always seemed on edge when I saw him, how he'd jump at small noises, the extra cameras he'd had installed around his property. He wasn't just paranoid, he was scared. I was so lost in thought that I almost missed the sound of tires on pavement. Headlights swept across the street as a car turned into the Thompson driveway. My heart sank. John was home. I watched as Thompson got out of his car, briefcase in hand. He was halfway to his front door when he spotted the hooded figure. He froze, the color draining from his face. I was out of my car in an instant, running towards them. "Mr. Thompson, I shouted. "Get inside. Now." Thompson didn't need to be told twice. He bolted for his door, fumbling with his keys. But the hooded figure was faster. In a blur of motion, he closed the distance between them, grabbing Thompson by the arm. I reached them just as Thompson's briefcase hit the ground, spilling papers everywhere. Without thinking, I tackled the hooded man, sending all three of us sprawling onto the manicured lawn. There was a confused tangle of limbs, the sound of fabric tearing. I felt something sharp graze my arm, and then I was staring into the face of our intruder. Or rather, the mask he wore, a featureless white expanse that seemed to glow in the dim light. "Stop!" I yelled, struggling to pin him down. "Police are on their way." But he was strong, impossibly strong. With a heave, he threw me off, sending me crashing into Thompson's hedges. By the time I scrambled to my feet, he was gone, melting into the shadows like he'd never been there at all. Thompson was huddled on his front step, shaking. "Is he gone?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah," I panted, helping him to his feet. "He's gone. Are you hurt?" Thompson shook his head, but his eyes were wild with fear. "You don't understand," he said. "He'll be back. He always comes back." Before I could ask what he meant, the night was filled with the wail of approaching sirens. Within minutes, the quiet street was a flurry of activity. Police cars, paramedics, forensics teams combing the area for evidence. I gave my statement to a detective describing the hooded figure and what had happened. When I mentioned the mask, the detective's eyes narrowed. "White mask, you say? Completely blank?" I nodded. "Yeah, why? Does that mean something to you?" The detective sighed, rubbing his temples. "Maybe. We've had a string of break-ins and assaults over the past year. Perpetrator always wears a white mask. Victims are all wealthy businessmen like Mr. Thompson here, but we've never been able to catch the guy or figure out his motive." As the night wore on, more details emerged. The papers scattered from Thompson's briefcase weren't financial documents. They were police reports, newspaper clippings, all related to the masked assailant. Thompson had been investigating him, trying to figure out who might be next. It was nearly dawn by the time things calmed down. As the last police car pulled away, I found Thompson sitting on his front porch, staring out at the street. "Mr. Thompson," I said gently, "can I ask? Who is he? Why is he after you?" Thompson was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow. "I don't know who he is, but I know why." He looked up at me, his eyes haunted. "A year ago, I made a bad investment, lost a lot of people a lot of money. Some of them, they lost everything." He ran a shaking hand through his hair. "At first, it was just angry phone calls, threats. But then people started getting hurt. Always men like me, financial advisors, investment bankers, always attacked by a man in a white mask." "Why didn't you go to the police?" I asked. Thompson laughed bitterly. "I did, but there was no proof it was connected to me. And honestly, part of me felt like I deserved it, like I was paying for my mistakes." I didn't know what to say. The sun was starting to rise, casting long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawns of Oakwood Estates. In the harsh light of day, the events of the night seemed almost surreal. "What will you do now?" I asked. Thompson stood up, straightening his rumpled suit. "I don't know, but I can't keep running, can't keep living in fear." He turned to me, a determined look in his eyes. "I'm going to find him, end this, one way or another." As I watched Thompson walk back into his house, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The masked man was still out there, waiting in the shadows, and something told me he wouldn't stop until he got what he came for. In the days that followed, security at Oakwood Estates was tripled. Police patrols became a regular sight, but every night as I made my rounds, I found myself scanning the darkness, half expecting to see that white mask gleaming in the shadows. The quiet nights suddenly felt oppressive, every rustle of leaves a potential threat. The residents, once so confident in their gated paradise, now hurried from their cars to their front doors, constantly looking over their shoulders. And me? I kept watching, kept waiting, because I knew that sooner or later he would be back. And next time, I'd be ready. The shadows may be long in Oakwood Estates, but I've learned that the darkest secrets often hide in plain sight, behind pristine facades and manicured lawns. And sometimes the real monsters aren't the ones lurking in the shadows, but the ones we invite into our lives, never suspecting the havoc they can wreak.